The assistant drove the CEO home that night, just another invisible errand for a single father barely surviving in the shadow of a tech empire. But when the rain blurred the windshield and her phone call cracked open a corporate secret, Dylan Cross saw something he was never meant to see. The woman who destroyed his life didn't even know his name. Yet. Before the story ends, she would learn exactly who he was and what happens when the underdog stops playing dead. If you're ready to see how far a broken man will go when he's got nothing left to lose, stick with me until the end. And if this story grabs you, hit that like button and drop a comment with your city. I want to see how far this one travels. Dylan Cross had gotten used to being invisible. It wasn't something that happened overnight. It was gradual, like erosion, small pieces of yourself wearing away until one day you looked in the mirror and didn't quite recognize what was left. He was 32, but the lines around his eyes made him look older. The gray hadn't started yet, but it would. Soon. His daughter Emma told him once that he looked tired even when he smiled. She was 6. 6-year-olds weren't supposed to notice things like that. But Emma noticed everything. Dylan stood in the break room of Drake Technologies, staring at the coffee maker like it held answers. The machine gurgled and hissed, spitting out something that barely qualified as coffee. Around him, the low hum of office chatter filled the air. Analysts discussing quarterly reports, assistants scheduling meetings for people who made more in a day than Dylan made in a year. He didn't participate. He never did. He just poured his coffee, added 2 sugars because the bitterness was too much otherwise, and moved through the building like a ghost. That was the safest way to survive here. Drake Technologies wasn't just a company, it was an empire. Vanessa Drake had built it from the ground up in less than a decade, turning a scrappy startup into a global powerhouse that controlled everything from AI development to biometric surveillance systems used by governments worldwide. She was 30 years old, impossibly wealthy, and utterly ruthless. The business world worshipped her, employees feared her, the media called her a visionary. Dylan had seen her exactly 3 times in the 2 years he'd worked here, always from a distance, always surrounded by a wall of executives and security personnel who moved like a coordinated machine. She didn't know his name, she didn't know he existed, and that was fine by him. Dylan's phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out, glancing at the screen with one eye while he sipped the terrible coffee. Emma's school. Reminder. Parent-teacher conference tomorrow, 3 p.m. He rubbed his eyes. Tomorrow was Thursday. He'd have to leave work early, which meant staying late tonight to make up the hours. His supervisor, Marcus, had a habit of counting every minute Dylan wasn't at his desk. Not because Dylan was bad at his job, he wasn't, but because Marcus enjoyed the power trip. Some people got off on having even a tiny slice of authority. Marcus was one of them. Dylan pocketed his phone and headed back to his desk, a cramped corner cubicle on the 3rd floor. The elevator was broken again, so he took the stairs. His knees ached. He was too young to feel this worn down, but exhaustion had become a permanent state. Between work, Emma, and the weight of memories he tried not to think about, there wasn't much left of him. Just enough to keep moving, just enough to keep her safe. He reached his floor and pushed through the stairwell door. The bullpen was buzzing. Someone had screwed up a data report for one of the executive presentations, and the fallout was ricocheting through the department like shrapnel. Heads were down. Keyboards clicked frantically. Dylan sat down, logged into his computer, and pulled up the spreadsheet he'd been working on for the past week. Numbers. Endless columns of numbers. Revenue projections, expense tracking, cost analysis for departments he'd never even heard of. He was good at this. Finding patterns, identifying discrepancies, organizing chaos into something clean and understandable. It was mindless work, the kind that didn't require him to think too hard, but it paid the bills. Barely. His daughter's face flashed in his mind. Emma, with her gap-toothed smile and wild curls that never stayed in the ponytail he tried to wrangle every morning before school. She'd inherited her mother's hair. Her mother's eyes, too, warm brown, curious, always looking at the world like it was full of secrets waiting to be discovered. She was the only thing that mattered. The only reason he dragged himself out of bed every day, swallowed his pride, and played the part of the harmless assistant who didn't ask questions and didn't cause problems. Because once upon a time, Dylan Cross had been someone else entirely. He pushed the thought away. He'd gotten good at that over the years, shoving memories down, locking them in a box somewhere deep where they couldn't reach him during the day. Nighttime was different. Nighttime, the box opened whether he wanted it to or not. The afternoon crawled by. At 5:30, most of the office emptied out. People had lives, families, plans. Dylan stayed. He always stayed. By 7, the floor was nearly silent except for the hum of overhead lights and the occasional ping of an email notification echoing through the empty space. He finished his report, double-checked the formulas 3 times because Marcus would look for any excuse to criticize, and sent it off with a polite subject line that made him feel slightly pathetic. His phone buzzed again. Mrs. Calloway. Hi, Dylan. Just confirming I can pick Emma up from school tomorrow if you're running late. Let me know. Mrs. Calloway was his neighbor, a retired teacher who'd taken a liking to Emma. She babysat sometimes, refused payment no matter how many times Dylan tried to slip her cash, and always sent Emma home with homemade cookies that tasted better than anything Dylan could produce. He didn't know what he'd do without her. Probably collapse. Dylan. Thanks, Mrs. C. I should be there on time, but I'll let you know if anything changes. He stood, stretched until his spine cracked, and grabbed his jacket from the back of his chair. The building was quieter at night. He liked it that way. Fewer people meant fewer chances of being noticed, fewer forced smiles and small talk about weather or sports he didn't follow. He took the stairs down to the lobby, nodded at the night security guard, a guy named Pete who never asked questions, and stepped out into the cool evening air. The city was alive with light and noise. Traffic hummed along the main avenue. Voices carried from nearby restaurants where people laughed over expensive meals and wine. Dylan walked 3 blocks to the subway station, descended into the fluorescent-lit tunnel that smelled faintly of oil and old concrete, and waited for the train. When it arrived, he squeezed into a crowded car and stood near the door, gripping the overhead rail while the train lurched forward. Across from him, a man in a suit scrolled through his phone, face bathed in blue light. A woman with headphones bobbed her head to music Dylan couldn't hear. A teenager slumped in a seat, asleep or pretending to be. Nobody looked at each other. Everyone was alone together, trapped in their own small worlds. Dylan understood that. He'd been living in his own small world for 3 years now. Dylan's stop came. He exited, climbed the stairs back to street level, and walked the remaining 6 blocks to his apartment building. It was a small place, 1 bedroom, which Emma claimed, and a pull-out couch in the living room where Dylan slept. The rent was too high for what they got, the water pressure was terrible, and the radiator clanked like it was possessed every night around 2 in the morning, but it was theirs. It was safe. Emma had her own space, her own walls covered in drawings she made at school. That was all that mattered. He unlocked the door and stepped inside. Emma was curled up on the couch, half asleep, a blanket with cartoon dinosaurs draped over her small frame. Mrs. Calloway sat in the armchair, knitting something that might have been a scarf, or possibly a very long hat. She looked up when Dylan entered, her face crinkling into a warm smile. She ate all her dinner, Mrs. Calloway said softly, setting her knitting aside. Chicken nuggets and broccoli. We read 2 chapters of that book you got her, the one about the girl who talks to animals. She's been dozing for about 20 minutes. Thank you, Dylan said, meaning it more than the words could convey. Really? I don't know what I'd do without you. Mrs. Calloway waved him off with a gesture that said the gratitude wasn't necessary. She's a delight. You know that. Smartest kid I've ever met, and I taught elementary school for 30 years. She stood, gathering her knitting and the empty plate Emma's dinner had been on. You look exhausted, Dylan. You taking care of yourself? Trying, he said, though they both knew it was a lie. She gave him a look, maternal, concerned, the kind of look that said she saw right through him but wasn't going to push. Not tonight. Get some rest. Both of you. After she left, Dylan locked the door and crouched beside the couch. Emma stirred, her eyes fluttering open. They were unfocused for a moment, then landed on him. Hey, Bug, he whispered. Hi, Daddy. Her voice was thick with sleep, barely more than a murmur. Time for bed. Can I sleep here? You'll get a crick in your neck. But it's cozy. He smiled despite himself, despite the weight pressing down on his chest. Come on. He scooped her up, her small arms wrapping loosely around his neck, and carried her to her room. She mumbled something about a field trip to the aquarium, her words trailing off as sleep pulled her under again. Dylan tucked her into bed, pulled the covers up to her chin, and kissed her forehead. She smelled like strawberry shampoo and childhood. Innocent, untouched by the ugliness of the world. He wanted to keep it that way. He'd do anything to keep it that way. He turned off the light and stood in the doorway for a moment, just watching her breathe, the rise and fall of her chest, the way her hand curled around the edge of the blanket. This was why he did it. Why he stayed quiet. Why he buried everything he used to be. He closed the door softly and went to the kitchen. There was leftover pasta in the fridge from 2 nights ago. He ate it cold, standing over the sink, too tired to bother heating it up. Then he collapsed onto the pull-out couch, still wearing his work clothes because changing felt like too much effort. His body ached in that deep, bone-tired way that came from months of not sleeping enough. His mind buzzed with the usual static: bills, work deadlines, Emma's upcoming birthday, the endless mental checklist of things he needed to do and couldn't afford to forget. He stared at the ceiling, counting cracks in the plaster, until sleep finally came. Boshkam. The next day started the same. Coffee that tasted like burnt rubber. Subway packed with bodies. Elevator that groaned like it might give up any second. Desk, computer, numbers. Dylan worked through lunch, finishing another report while eating a protein bar that tasted like cardboard. He checked the time. 2:15. He needed to leave by 2:30 to make the parent-teacher conference. He fired off a quick email to Marcus, shut down his computer, and grabbed his jacket. Marcus appeared out of nowhere like he had some kind of sensor that detected when people were about to leave. "Leaving early?" Dylan kept his voice even, professional. "Parent-teacher thing. Sent you an email." Marcus frowned as if Dylan had personally inconvenienced him by having a child. "We've got the quarterly review coming up. I need those numbers by Monday." "They'll be done. They better be." Marcus looked like he wanted to say more, maybe make some comment about commitment or dedication, but he just shook his head and walked away. Dylan nodded, didn't argue, and left before Marcus could think of another reason to hassle him. The school was across town, a 40-minute subway ride that felt longer because Dylan kept checking his watch. He made it with 5 minutes to spare, signing in at the front desk and following the signs to Emma's classroom. Ms. Rodriguez was waiting, a young teacher with bright eyes and the kind of energy that suggested she still believed she could change the world one kid at a time. Maybe she could. "Mr. Cross, thank you for coming." She shook his hand warmly. "Of course." They sat in tiny chairs meant for 6-year-olds, and Ms. Rodriguez spent 20 minutes telling Dylan how bright Emma was, how creative, how kind to the other children. She showed him drawings Emma had made, stories she'd written in her messy handwriting. Dylan listened, smiled, nodded. He was proud. So damn proud it hurt. "She talks about you all the time," Miss Rodriguez said, leaning forward slightly. "She adores you. You can tell she feels safe with you." Dylan's throat tightened. He swallowed hard. "She's the best thing I've got." Miss Rodriguez smiled, but there was something sad in her eyes. She'd probably seen a lot of single parents over the years, a lot of kids being raised by exhausted adults doing their best. "She's lucky to have you." After the conference, Dylan picked Emma up from the after-school program. She ran to him when she saw him, backpack bouncing, and threw her arms around his waist. "Daddy." "Hey, Bug, how was your day?" "Good. We learned about fractions, and I got to feed the turtle." They stopped for ice cream on the way home, her favorite mint chocolate chip. Dylan got vanilla because it was cheapest. They sat on a bench outside the shop, Emma swinging her legs and chattering about her day, about her friend Sophie who could do a cartwheel, about the turtle they had in the classroom whose name was Mr. Shelby. Dylan listened, really listened, letting her voice wash over him like a balm. For a little while, the weight lifted. They got home around 6. Dylan made spaghetti while Emma worked on a drawing at the kitchen table, something involving a princess and a dragon who were apparently best friends. They ate together, cleaned up together, and then Dylan helped her with her homework. Math problems that seemed too advanced for first grade. But what did he know? By 8:30, she was in bed again, and Dylan was back on the couch, staring at his laptop. He had work to finish. Always work to finish. But his mind kept drifting. He thought about his wife, about Lily. She'd been gone for 3 years now, and the grief had dulled into something manageable, something he could carry without collapsing under the weight. But it never really left. It just changed shape, became a permanent ache instead of a screaming wound. She died in a car accident. That's what the police report said. Single vehicle collision. Mechanical failure. Faulty brakes that gave out on a steep hill. The car went off the road, hit a tree. She died on impact. Tragic, but not suspicious. Just one of those things that happen sometimes. Except Dylan had never believed it. Lily had been an investigative journalist, the kind who won awards for exposing corruption and holding powerful people accountable. She'd been working on something big in the months before she died, something involving corporate malfeasance, experimental technology, cover-ups that reached into places most people didn't even know existed. She'd been close to breaking the story when she died, close enough that she'd stopped telling Dylan the details because she didn't want him involved, didn't want him at risk. And the company at the center of it all? Drake Technologies. Dylan had spent months after her death trying to find proof, trying to connect the dots. He'd talked to her sources, read through her notes, followed every lead she'd left behind. But he was just one man, grieving and broke, with a newborn daughter who needed him more than he needed answers. Eventually he'd given up. Or maybe he'd just run out of fight. Maybe the weight of keeping Emma alive and fed and safe had crushed whatever was left of the person he used to be. He'd taken the job at Drake Technologies 2 years ago out of pure desperation. He needed the paycheck, the health insurance, the stability. The irony wasn't lost on him, working for the company that killed his wife. But he told himself it didn't matter. He was nobody here, just an assistant, invisible. He could take their money, keep his head down, and give Emma the life she deserved. Except lately, something had been shifting inside him. Old instincts, old reflexes. The part of him that used to strategize, manipulate outcomes, predict what people would do 3 moves ahead. He'd buried it deep, locked it away with the grief and the rage, but it was clawing its way back to the surface. He'd catch himself analyzing conversations in the break room, picking up on power dynamics and hidden agendas. He'd notice things, inconsistencies in reports, patterns in executive movements, the way certain departments got funding while others were quietly dismantled. He told himself it didn't mean anything, but he was lying. Dylan shut his laptop and rubbed his face with both hands, pressing his palms against his eyes until he saw stars. Not tonight. He didn't have the energy for this tonight. Bod. Friday came and went. Dylan survived another day at the office, another quiet crisis where Marcus yelled at someone who wasn't him. Another weekend with Emma, park on Saturday, library on Sunday, laundry and groceries, and the endless maintenance of trying to keep their small life running. Another week of staying quiet, staying invisible, staying safe. Then Monday arrived, and everything changed. It started with an email. Dylan was halfway through his morning coffee, staring at a spreadsheet that refused to make sense, when the notification popped up in the corner of his screen. From Executive Office. Subject, Special Assignment. Dylan stared at it, confused. He never got emails from the executive office. Ever. His world existed 3 floors below theirs, in a different universe entirely. He opened it. Dylan Cross, you have been selected to assist with a high-priority task this evening. Report to the executive garage at 7 p.m. Further instructions will be provided on site. This is a mandatory assignment. Executive Office, Drake Technologies. Dylan read it 3 times, his confusion deepening with each pass. High-priority task. Executive garage. Mandatory. What the hell? He forwarded the email to Marcus asking if this was legitimate or some kind of phishing scam. Marcus responded within minutes. Yeah, it's real. No idea what it's about. Just do what they say and don't screw it up. Dylan sat back in his chair, heart thudding harder than it should. This didn't make sense. He was nobody. A low-level assistant who processed expense reports and tracked departmental budgets? Why would the executive office need him for anything? The rest of the day dragged. Dylan couldn't focus. He kept checking the email, rereading it, trying to find some clue he'd missed. By 6:30, he'd given up on being productive. He packed up his things, sent Emma a text letting her know Mrs. Calloway would put her to bed tonight, and headed down to the executive garage. The executive garage was on the building's lowest level, accessible only by a private elevator that required a keycard Dylan didn't have. When he arrived at 6:50, a security guard was waiting at the elevator bank, different from the usual guards, this one wearing a suit instead of a uniform. The man scanned Dylan's ID badge with a handheld device, then handed him a temporary keycard. 7th floor. Someone will meet you. What's this about? Dylan asked. The guard's expression didn't change. 7th floor. Dylan took the keycard and stepped into the elevator. The doors slid shut with a soft hiss. His reflection stared back at him from the polished steel, tired eyes, cheap suit that he'd bought at a discount store 3 years ago, expression carefully neutral. He looked like exactly what he was. Nobody important. The elevator descended smoothly. No groaning or shuddering like the one that serviced the regular floors. When the doors opened, Dylan stepped into a sleek, dimly lit garage that looked like something out of a movie. Luxury cars gleamed under soft lighting. Tesla, Mercedes, something that might have been a Bentley. The air smelled faintly of leather and expensive cologne. A woman in a tailored suit approached. She was maybe 40, sharp-eyed, moving with the efficiency of someone who'd perfected the art of not wasting time. "Mr. Cross?" "Yeah. I'm Helen Ortiz, Miss Drake's chief of staff. You'll be driving Miss Drake home tonight. Her usual driver called in sick, and you were flagged as having a valid license and clean driving record." Dylan blinked. "I'm not a driver." "You have a valid license, correct?" "Yeah, but—" "Then you're qualified. The car is over here." She gestured toward a sleek black sedan that probably cost more than Dylan's entire existence. "Ms. Drake is attending a charity gala tonight at the Regency Hotel. You'll pick her up at 10:30 and drive her to her penthouse. The address is already programmed into the GPS. Do not speak unless spoken to. Do not ask questions. Do not deviate from the route. Understood?" Dylan's jaw tightened. This was insane. Understood. Helen handed him the keys, actual keys, not a fob, and a laminated card with instructions. "Be at the Regency by 10:15. Park in the VIP pickup zone. Ms. Drake will come out at 10:30. Don't be late." Then she walked away, heels clicking against the concrete, leaving Dylan standing there holding the keys to a car that probably had more technology than his entire apartment building. He stood there for a long moment, trying to process what just happened. He was about to drive Vanessa Drake home, the woman who killed his wife. Dylan sat in the driver's seat of the sedan, hands gripping the leather-wrapped steering wheel, staring at the dashboard. The car was immaculate. Leather interior so soft it felt like sitting on a cloud. State-of-the-art everything, touchscreen displays, cameras showing every angle around the vehicle, seat warmers he accidentally turned on and couldn't figure out how to turn off. The kind of car that cost more than he'd make in 5 years, maybe 10. He checked the time on the dashboard display. 7:45. He had almost 3 hours to kill before he needed to be at the Regency. He tried to calm his breathing, but his heart was pounding like he'd just run a marathon. This was fine. He'd drive her home. She wouldn't even look at him. He was just the help. Another nameless employee doing a job. She probably went through dozens of assistants and drivers without ever registering their faces. He'd be invisible, same as always, but his hands were shaking. He thought about Lily, about the night she'd come home late, exhausted but energized, telling him she was close to something big, about the way her eyes lit up when she talked about exposing the truth, about holding powerful people accountable, about the way she'd looked at him the last time he saw her, kissed him goodbye at the door, promised she'd be careful. And then she was gone. Dylan closed his eyes, pressing his forehead against the steering wheel. He couldn't afford to think about this. Not now. Not when he needed to keep it together. He pulled out his phone and texted Mrs. Calloway, confirming that she had Emma for the night. Then he sat there in the quiet garage, surrounded by cars worth more than most people's houses, and waited. At 10, he started the engine. The car purred to life, smooth and nearly silent. He followed the GPS through the city streets, the rain that had been threatening all evening finally starting to fall. By the time he reached the Regency Hotel, it was coming down hard, drumming against the windshield. Dylan pulled into the VIP pickup zone exactly at 10:15. A valet in a red jacket approached, saw the Drake Technologies emblem on the car, and immediately stepped back with a nod. Dylan waited. Other cars came and went. Men in tuxedos and women in evening gowns emerged from the hotel, laughing, talking, climbing into vehicles that whisked them away to whatever came next in their privileged lives. Dylan watched them, invisible behind tinted windows. At 10:30 exactly, the hotel doors opened. Vanessa Drake stepped out. She was exactly as he'd seen in photos and from a distance in the building. Tall, maybe 5'9", with sharp features and dark hair pulled back in a way that looked effortless, but probably required a professional. She wore a black gown that looked like it cost more than Dylan's car, simple and elegant in a way that screamed wealth. Her posture was perfect. Her expression was unreadable, not cold exactly, but closed off, untouchable. A security detail flanked her, two men in dark suits with earpieces who scanned the area with professional paranoia. She said something to one of them, and he nodded, stepping back. Then she walked toward the car. Dylan got out, came around to open the rear door. Rain soaked through his jacket immediately. He stood there, hand on the door, as Vanessa approached without acknowledging his existence. She slid into the back seat, phone already in her hand, eyes on the screen. Dylan closed the door, got back behind the wheel, and started driving. The rain picked up, sheets of water obscuring the windshield. The wipers beat a steady rhythm. In the rearview mirror, Vanessa was illuminated by the glow of her phone, scrolling through something, her face cold and focused. She might as well have been alone. Dylan kept his eyes on the road, hands at 10 and 2, breathing steady. For 10 minutes, there was only silence except for the rain and the hum of expensive tires on wet pavement. Then her phone rang. She answered without hesitation. "What is it?" Dylan couldn't hear the voice on the other end, but Vanessa's tone shifted immediately. Sharper, irritated. The temperature in the car seemed to drop. "I don't care what the board thinks," she said, her voice cutting through the quiet like a blade. "The trials move forward. We've invested too much to stop now." A pause. Dylan watched her in the mirror. Her jaw was tight. If they can't handle the risks, they shouldn't have signed on. This is exactly what we discussed 6 months ago. Nothing has changed. Her tone was ice now, precise and brutal. "Tell Garrett I want the data by Friday. All of it. If there are complications, I'll handle them personally." Another pause. Longer this time. "No." The single word carried absolute finality. "We bury it. Same as last time. The families signed NDAs. They'll be compensated. Move on." Dylan's grip on the wheel tightened until his knuckles went white. Vanessa ended the call without saying goodbye and tossed her phone onto the seat beside her. She let out a breath, the first sign of any emotion, then went back to scrolling through emails like the conversation had never happened. Dylan's mind was racing. Trials, data, complications, families, NDAs. The same words Lily had used 3 years ago when she talked about the story she was chasing. The same language that had appeared in her notes, the fragments Dylan had found after she died. The rain hammered harder against the windshield. Vanessa's penthouse was in the heart of the city, a glass tower that scraped the sky and made everything around it look small. Dylan pulled into the underground garage, navigating through security checkpoints with the credentials Helen had given him, and stopped at the private elevator entrance. "Wait here," Vanessa said as she got out, not looking at him. Dylan nodded, even though she wasn't watching. She disappeared into the elevator, one of the security guys following her. The other stayed behind, standing near the car with his hands clasped in front of him. Dylan sat there, engine idling, hands still trembling slightly. He should leave. He should forget what he heard. It wasn't his business. He was just the driver tonight, nothing more. But instead, he turned off the engine and got out of the car. The security guy looked at him. "Something wrong?" "Bathroom," Dylan said. The guy hesitated, then gestured toward a door marked Service. "Through there. First door on the right." Dylan nodded and walked toward it, heart pounding. The service door was unlocked. He slipped through into a sterile hallway lit by harsh fluorescent lights. It smelled like cleaning chemicals and recycled air. This was the part of the building regular people weren't supposed to see. Maintenance corridors, storage spaces, the mechanical guts that kept everything running. Dylan moved quickly, quietly, the way he used to move a long time ago. There was another door at the end of the hall, slightly ajar, light spilling out. He approached, listening. Silence. He pushed the door open. Inside was a small office. Filing cabinets lined one wall. A desk sat in the corner, stacked with folders and binders, a computer monitor dark. It looked like a records room or maybe a private office for building management. Dylan stepped inside. He shouldn't be here. This was insane. If he got caught, he'd be fired at minimum, arrested at worst. But his hands moved anyway, muscle memory from another life. He pulled open the nearest filing cabinet. Personnel files. Building maintenance records. Nothing interesting. Second cabinet. Financial documents. Expense reports. Third cabinet. The drawer was locked. Dylan looked around, found a letter opener on the desk, and used it to jimmy the lock. It took 30 seconds. Inside were folders. Lots of them, labeled with codes he didn't recognize. He flipped through them quickly, and then he saw it. A folder near the back, thicker than the others, labeled Project Sentinel, Phase 3 Trial Results. Dylan pulled it out, hands shaking now. He opened it. Inside were documents, medical reports, test results, charts tracking biological responses to something he couldn't identify from the terminology. But what he could identify were the names. Human test subjects, dozens of them. Each entry included a name, date of enrollment, trial phase, and outcome. Most of the outcomes read adverse event or discontinued medical. A few read completed. Several read deceased. Dylan's heart stopped. He flipped through the pages, scanning names, dates, looking for something he didn't want to find. And there, 3/4 through the file, was a name that made the world tilt sideways. Cross, Lillian M. Enrollment date, March 14th, trial. Phase 3. Outcome, deceased. Mechanical failure. Vehicle collision. Dylan stared at the page. The words didn't make sense. They couldn't make sense. Lily hadn't been part of any trial. She'd been investigating the company, not working for them. His mind raced, fragments clicking together. Unless she hadn't told him, unless she'd gone undercover, unless she'd enrolled herself to get close to the story, or unless they'd made it look like an accident after she got too close. Footsteps echoed in the hallway outside. Dylan's training kicked in. He closed the folder, shoved it back into place, shut the drawer, and moved toward the door in 3 seconds flat. The footsteps were getting closer. He slipped out of the office, pulled the door nearly closed behind him, and walked quickly back toward the service entrance. He pushed through just as someone entered the hallway behind him. The security guy was still standing by the car, looking bored. Dylan got into the driver's seat, started the engine, and sat there trying to control his breathing. His wife's name. In a file. In a folder labeled with the same project she'd been investigating. Marked as deceased. Listed as a trial participant. The elevator doors opened. Vanessa emerged, alone now, heels clicking against the concrete. She walked to the car without looking at him. Dylan got out, opened the door. She slid into the back seat. He closed the door, got behind the wheel, and drove. The ride back to the hotel garage was silent. Vanessa went back to her phone. Dylan drove on autopilot, his mind spinning through everything he'd just seen. When they arrived, Vanessa got out without a word. Didn't thank him, didn't acknowledge him, just walked away like he didn't exist. Dylan sat there in the driver's seat, hands gripping the wheel so hard his fingers ached. Lily's name. In Vanessa Drake's files. The woman who'd just casually discussed burying complications and compensating families. The woman who ran the empire that killed his wife. Something inside Dylan, something he'd kept buried for 3 years, something he'd convinced himself was dead, woke up. He wasn't invisible anymore. He was calculating. And Vanessa Drake had no idea what was coming. Dylan didn't sleep that night. He sat on the pull-out couch in the dark, laptop open, but the screen blurred in front of him. His mind kept replaying the image of that file folder, his wife's name printed in clinical black text next to the word deceased. 3 years he'd believed the police report. 3 years he'd swallowed the story about faulty brakes and tragic accidents. 3 years he'd forced himself to move forward because Emma needed a father who could function, who could wake up in the morning and make breakfast and pretend the world hadn't ended. All of it had been a lie. The apartment was quiet except for the radiator's familiar clanking and the distant sound of traffic from the street below. Emma was asleep in her room, safe behind a door covered in crayon drawings and gold star stickers from school. She had no idea that her father's entire world had just split open, that the careful control he'd maintained for 3 years was cracking at the edges. Dylan wanted to keep it that way. She'd lost her mother. She didn't need to lose him too, didn't need to watch him spiral into whatever dark place he could feel pulling at him like an undertow. But he couldn't just sit here and do nothing. Around 3 in the morning, Dylan pulled up a browser window and started searching. He didn't know exactly what he was looking for, just anything that might connect the dots between Lily's death and Project Sentinel. Drake Technologies, Phase 3 trials, experimental research. He tried every combination he could think of. The internet gave him nothing. Every search returned the same polished corporate website, glowing press releases about innovation and technological progress. Articles praising Vanessa Drake's genius and vision. Forbes calling her the youngest self-made billionaire in tech. Business Insider profiling her leadership style. Nothing about illegal trials. Nothing about dead participants. Nothing about the bodies buried beneath the empire. Of course not. People like Vanessa didn't leave evidence lying around where anyone could find it. Dylan leaned back against the couch cushions, rubbing his eyes until he saw spots dancing in the darkness. He needed to be smart about this. Rushing in would get him fired at best, disappeared at worst. He had Emma to think about. Bills that wouldn't pay themselves. A life to maintain even while everything inside him screamed for action, for justice, for revenge. The word tasted bitter in his mind. Revenge. He'd never thought of himself as that kind of person. But then again, he'd never thought his wife had been murdered either. He closed the laptop and tried to sleep. Failed. At 5:30, he gave up and made coffee in the small kitchen, standing at the counter while the machine dripped and hissed. The coffee tasted like ashes, but he drank it anyway, staring out the window at the city waking up. Lights flickering on in apartments across the street. Early commuters heading to the subway. The world moving forward like nothing had changed. By the time Emma woke up at 7, Dylan had showered, shaved, and put on the mask of normalcy he'd perfected over the years. He made her breakfast. Scrambled eggs, the way she liked them, slightly runny, with cheese melted on top, and listened to her talk about the aquarium field trip coming up next week. She was excited about seeing the jellyfish. Her teacher said they glowed in the dark. "Can we get a jellyfish, Daddy?" "They need saltwater tanks, Bug. Pretty complicated." "But they're so pretty." "They are. We'll take lots of pictures when you go, okay?" She nodded, satisfied with that compromise, and went back to eating her eggs. Dylan smiled in the right places, asked questions about which friends were in her group, helped her find her homework folder when she couldn't remember where she'd put it. The performance was automatic now. He could do this in his sleep. "You okay, Daddy?" Emma asked while he was tying her shoes by the front door. Dylan looked up. Her brown eyes were studying his face with an intensity that always caught him off guard. "Yeah, Bug. Why?" "You look sad." Kids really did see everything. Dylan forced his smile wider, hoping it reached his eyes. "Just tired, work stuff, nothing for you to worry about." She studied him for a moment longer, those two observant eyes seeing more than he wanted them to, then nodded slowly. "Okay." He walked her to school, holding her small hand in his, and hugged her goodbye at the entrance. Watched her disappear through the doors with her oversized backpack bouncing against her shoulders. Then he turned and headed for the subway, the mask slipping away as soon as she was out of sight. The morning commute was the usual crush of bodies and noise and stale air. Dylan stood in the corner of the train car, hand gripping the overhead rail, and let himself think. He needed information. Real information, not the sanitized version the company fed to the public. And there was only one way to get it. He had to go deeper into the belly of the beast. He had to stop being invisible. Had to make himself useful enough that people stopped seeing him as just another low-level assistant shuffling papers in a forgotten corner of the third floor. The realization settled over him like a familiar coat he'd forgotten he owned. This was what he used to do, back before Emma, before Lily died, back when he'd been someone who understood how power worked and how to manipulate it. Strategic thinking, pattern recognition, reading people, predicting their moves, staying 3 steps ahead. He'd walked away from that life because it had cost him too much. The stress, the constant calculation, the inability to turn it off. Lily had worried about him back then, told him he was burning himself out. He'd promised her he'd find something different, something that didn't require him to be that person anymore. And he had. For a while. But maybe it was time to remember who he'd been. Maybe that was the only way to get justice for what they'd done to her. Dylan arrived at Drake Technologies and badged through security like he did every morning. Took the stairs to the 3rd floor because the elevator was still broken. Sat down at his cramped desk and logged into his computer. But this time he was watching, listening, paying attention to things he'd trained himself to ignore. The office buzzed around him with its usual rhythms. People talking about weekend plans, Someone complaining about the coffee machine. An analyst 2 cubicles over cursing at a spreadsheet that wouldn't balance. Normal Tuesday morning chaos. Dylan opened his email and started working through the messages, but his mind was operating on a different level now. Cataloging. Processing. Building a map of how this place actually functioned beneath the surface. Marcus came by his desk around 10, carrying a coffee that smelled significantly better than what came out of the break room machine. "You survived last night, I see." Dylan looked up from his computer. "Yeah, it was fine. Driving the queen around." Marcus smirked, clearly enjoying the idea of Dylan being reduced to chauffeur duty. "Bet that was surreal." "She didn't say 2 words to me. That's Vanessa Drake for you. Doesn't waste time on people who can't do something for her." Marcus dropped a stack of folders on Dylan's desk with a thud that rattled his coffee cup. "New expense reports. Need them reconciled by end of day. Some of the receipts are a mess, so good luck with that." "Sure." Marcus walked away, already pulling out his phone. Dylan opened the first folder and stared at the receipts inside. Dinners at restaurants he'd never heard of, hotels in cities he'd never visit, charges that cost more than his monthly rent. Vanessa Drake doesn't waste time on people who can't do something for her. That was the key, wasn't it? If Dylan wanted access, he needed to become useful, not just competent, but indispensable. Someone she noticed. Someone who could solve problems that mattered to her. The question was how. Dylan spent his lunch break in the building's library, a small, underused space on the 5th floor that most employees didn't even know existed. He'd discovered it months ago while looking for a quiet place to eat his sandwich away from the break room small talk. Today, he had a different purpose. He pulled up old internal newsletters on one of the ancient desktop computers, corporate announcements, archived emails from before his time at the company. Anything that might give him insight into how Drake Technologies actually operated beneath the glossy surface. Project Sentinel wasn't mentioned anywhere. Of course not. A secret research program wouldn't be advertised in the company newsletter. But there were other things if you knew what to look for. References to research divisions that didn't appear on the current organizational chart. Budget line items for departments that had no listed personnel. Funding allocated to facilities with addresses that didn't match any Drake Technologies buildings Dylan knew about. He started taking notes on his phone, looking for patterns, connections that might not be obvious to someone who wasn't searching for them. His phone buzzed with a text from Mrs. Calloway. "Picking Emma up today. Taking her to the park if that's okay. Weather's too nice to waste." Dylan: "Perfect. Thank you so much." Mrs. Calloway: "My pleasure, dear. Don't work too hard." Dylan smiled despite everything and went back to his research. By the time his lunch hour was over, he had the beginnings of a map in his head. Invisible connections between executives, money flowing to places it shouldn't, research happening in shadows that the public would never see. He just needed to follow the threads. Over the next week, Dylan changed his routine in small, deliberate ways. He started staying later at the office, not just to finish his assigned work, but to observe. He learned which executives came and went at what times, who met with whom in the conference rooms, which assistants had access to which files and systems. He made himself visible, but in careful doses. Fixed a printer jam on the executive floor when everyone else had gone home. Stayed late to help a stressed manager who'd corrupted an important file and was panicking about a morning presentation. Volunteered for the assignments nobody else wanted, the tedious data entry, the endless reconciliations, the thankless tasks that made other people's jobs easier. People started to notice him. Not in any significant way, not yet, but enough. A nod in the hallway instead of walking past like he was furniture. A "thanks, Dylan," instead of just "thanks." His actual name instead of "you there" or "hey." It was a start. On Thursday evening, Dylan was working late, the office nearly empty around him, when he heard voices from the break room, low and tense. He saved his work and stood up, stretching like he was just taking a break, and wandered toward the coffee maker. 2 executives he vaguely recognized were standing by the window, talking in voices that were trying to be quiet, but not quite managing it. Dylan recognized one of them, Sarah Chen, VP, of something he couldn't remember. The other was an older man in an expensive suit. "Budget meeting got moved up," Sarah was saying, agitation clear in her voice. "Vanessa wants the Sentinel projections updated before next week." The older man rubbed his face. "Garrett's going to lose his mind. The data's not ready. Half the metrics are still being analyzed." When is anything ever ready on her timeline? She doesn't care. She wants what she wants, and we scramble to make it happen. This isn't like pushing a product launch, Sarah. This is human trial data. If we rush the analysis, I know, trust me, I know. But you try telling Vanessa Drake no. They both fell silent for a moment. Dylan poured his coffee slowly, keeping his back to them, every sense focused on listening. Sarah sighed. When's the presentation? Tuesday, which gives us 5 days to pull together something that should take 3 weeks. Can Garrett do it? He'll have to. They left, still talking, voices fading down the hallway. Dylan stood there with his coffee, mind racing. Garrett. He'd heard that name before, on Vanessa's phone call the night he'd driven her home, and now connected directly to Project Sentinel. Dylan returned to his desk and pulled up the company directory on his computer. There were 3 Garretts employed at Drake Technologies according to the system. 2 worked in marketing. The third was Dr. Garrett Finch, listed as Director of Advanced Research, working out of an office on the 9th floor. Dylan memorized the name and office number, then got back to work. The following Monday, opportunity knocked in an unexpected way. Dylan was at his desk, finishing the endless reconciliation Marcus had dumped on him, when his supervisor appeared looking more harried than usual. You busy? Dylan gestured at his screen, where columns of numbers marched down the spreadsheet. Just finishing the quarterly reconciliation. How fast can you finish it? Dylan glanced at what was left. Give me 20 minutes. Marcus checked his watch. A nervous gesture Dylan had learned meant he was already late for something. Make it 10. I need you to run something up to the 9th floor. The 9th floor, executive territory, where Dr. Garrett Finch had his office. Dylan's pulse quickened, but he kept his face calm and slightly confused, like this was just another errand. Sure, what is it? Dr. Finch's office. He requested some historical budget data for a presentation he's working on. I was supposed to deliver it an hour ago, but I've been stuck on a call with accounting trying to track down a missing expense report. Marcus dropped a flash drive on Dylan's desk. Everything's on there. Just give it to his assistant and come back. Simple. Got it. Dylan finished his work in 8 minutes, sent the file to Marcus, grabbed the flash drive, and headed for the elevator. His mind raced as he rode up to the 9th floor. This was exactly the kind of access he needed, dropped into his lap like the universe had decided to help him out. Dr. Garrett Finch, the man running advanced research, the man whose name kept coming up in connection with Project Sentinel, the man who apparently reported directly to Vanessa. The elevator doors opened onto a different world from the cramped cubicle farm on the 3rd floor. The 9th floor was all glass walls and sleek modern furniture, the kind of minimalist design that screamed money. The carpet was thick enough to muffle footsteps. The art on the walls looked expensive and vaguely abstract in a way Dylan didn't understand. He found Dr. Finch's office easily, corner suite with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. The view alone probably cost more than Dylan made in a year. A young woman sat at a desk outside the office, typing rapidly on a keyboard with the kind of focused intensity that suggested she was racing a deadline. She looked up when Dylan approached, her expression shifting from concentration to polite inquiry. Can I help you? Delivery from budgeting, flash drive for Dr. Finch. Dylan held it up. She held out her hand without standing. I'll make sure he gets it. This was the moment. Dylan could hand over the flash drive and walk away, another invisible errand boy completing a task. Or he could take a risk. He hesitated just long enough to seem uncertain. I'm supposed to make sure it has the right files. Marcus's orders. Can I just verify with Dr. Finch real quick? He was pretty specific about what he needed. The assistant frowned, clearly not thrilled about the interruption. He's on a call. I'll wait. Won't take more than a minute once he's free. She looked like she wanted to argue, but apparently decided it wasn't worth the effort. Fine. Sit over there. She pointed at a row of chairs along the wall. Dylan sat and pulled out his phone, pretending to check emails while he actually observed everything around him. The assistant's desk had 3 monitors, all showing different spreadsheets and databases. A stack of folders sat in her inbox, labels facing away from him. A framed photo showed her with what looked like a large family at some kind of celebration. Through the glass wall of Finch's office, Dylan could see a man in his 50s, gray hair cut short, expensive suit that fit perfectly. He was pacing while he talked on the phone, gesturing with his free hand. His face was tight with frustration, jaw clenched. The assistant went back to her typing. Dylan waited, counting the seconds, watching. After 5 minutes that felt like an hour, Finch's office door opened. He stepped out, still looking irritated, and spotted Dylan immediately. "Jennifer, where's the data I requested?" The assistant, Jennifer, pointed at Dylan without looking away from her screens. "He just brought it. Wants to verify the files with you first. Marcus's protocol, apparently." Finch looked at Dylan for the first time, really looked, his expression somewhere between impatience and assessment. "Who are you?" Dylan stood, keeping his posture respectful but not servile. "Dylan Cross, sir, budgeting department. Just following protocol to make sure you got exactly what you asked for." Finch sighed, the sound of a man with too many things to do and not enough time. "Fine. Give it here." Dylan handed over the flash drive. Finch walked back into his office, plugged it into his laptop, and spent 30 seconds scanning through the contents. His expression shifted slightly, still irritated, but less so. He nodded once. "This is fine. Tell Marcus I need the full historical breakdown by tomorrow morning, not just the summary data. The presentation needs more depth than what he sent. I'll let him know." Finch was already turning away, dismissing him, but Dylan took a calculated risk. The kind of risk the old version of himself would have taken without hesitation. "Sir, if you need any other data pulled for the presentation, I'm pretty good with the budget system. Know it better than most people down there. Might save some time if I handle the request directly instead of going through Marcus as a middleman." Finch paused mid-turn and looked back at him. Really looked this time, not just glancing. There was something assessing in his gaze, like he was trying to figure out if Dylan was overstepping or actually offering something useful. "You work for Marcus?" "Yes, sir." "How long?" 2 years. "You any good?" Dylan met his eyes. "I don't make mistakes, and I don't miss deadlines." Something shifted in Finch's expression. Not quite interest, but not dismissal either. More like consideration. "What's your name again?" "Dylan Cross." Finch nodded slowly, filing that information away. "I'll keep that in mind. If I need anything, I'll reach out directly." It wasn't much, just a crack in the door, but that was all Dylan needed. "Thank you, sir." Dylan left the executive floor, took the elevator back down to the 3rd floor, and returned to his desk. On the outside, he looked the same as always. Tired, slightly rumpled, forgettable. On the inside, something was shifting, pieces moving into place, a strategy forming. He was playing the game again, and it felt dangerous and familiar all at once, like putting on shoes he'd forgotten how well they fit. That night, after Emma was asleep, after dinner and homework and bath time, and 2 chapters of the book about talking animals, Dylan sat at his laptop and started digging deeper into Dr. Garrett Finch. Medical degree from Stanford, PhD in biomedical engineering from MIT, 20 years in pharmaceutical research before joining Drake Technologies 5 years ago. Published papers on neural interfaces and biotech applications, all legitimate and peer-reviewed. Nothing controversial. Nothing that screamed criminal. But the pieces were there if you looked closely enough. Finch ran advanced research. Vanessa had mentioned his name in connection with trial data. Lily's file had listed Project Sentinel as a Phase 3 trial under the Advanced Research Division. Dylan needed to get into Finch's files, the real ones, not the sanitized versions accessible through normal channels. The research data, the trial protocols, the participant records. The question was how to do it without getting caught. The next morning, Dylan arrived early and volunteered to help the IT department with a system update they were rolling out across the 3rd and 4th floors. He spent 3 hours watching the tech guys work, asking questions that seemed innocent but were actually mapping the company's network architecture in his head. Most of it was locked down tight, multi-factor authentication, access logs, encrypted drives. But there were always vulnerabilities if you knew where to look. And people were almost always the weakest link in any security system. By lunchtime, Dylan had identified a potential access point. Executive assistants used a shared drive to transfer large files between departments. Presentation decks, data sets, reports too big for email. The security wasn't as tight as it should be because the drive was considered internal and low risk. If he could get login credentials for one of those assistants, he might be able to see what they were sharing. And maybe, if he was lucky, find something connecting to Project Sentinel. The question was how to get those credentials without raising suspicion. Dylan spent the afternoon thinking through options while mechanically processing expense reports. social engineering, pretending to be IT, and asking someone to verify their password. Too risky, too many things that could go wrong. Phishing, sending a fake email that harvested credentials, potentially traceable back to him. Old-fashioned observation, watching someone type their password. Required being in the right place at the right time, and people were usually careful about that. He was still mulling it over, weighing risks and probabilities, when his phone rang. Unknown number. Hello? Is this Dylan Cross? A woman's voice, professional and crisp. Yes? This is Helen Ortiz, Miss Drake's chief of staff. We need a driver for Miss Drake again this evening. Her regular driver is still out sick. Are you available? Dylan's heart rate spiked, adrenaline flooding his system. Another chance to get close, another chance to observe, to listen, maybe to learn something that could help him. Yeah, I can do that. Same arrangement as last time, executive garage, 7 p.m. Ms. Drake has a dinner engagement and will need transport home afterward. I'll be there. Helen hung up without saying goodbye. Dylan sat back in his chair, mind already racing through possibilities. What could he realistically accomplish tonight? Vanessa wouldn't just leave classified documents lying around in the car. She probably wouldn't even talk on the phone if she'd learned anything from last time. Though people often assumed conversations in cars were private, forgetting about the driver. But people made mistakes. Everyone did eventually, no matter how careful they thought they were. Dylan texted Mrs. Calloway, confirming she could watch Emma tonight. Got an immediate affirmative response with a reminder that she'd made cookies Emma would love. The rest of the day crawled by. Dylan went through the motions of work, responding to emails, reconciling spreadsheets, looking exactly like what everyone thought he was. A low-level assistant going through another boring Tuesday. At 6:30, he headed down to the executive garage. The same security guard was there, recognized him with a slight nod this time. Dylan collected the keys to the same black sedan and settled into the driver's seat. He had 20 minutes before he needed to pick up Vanessa. He used them to search the car more thoroughly than last time. Glove compartment, center console, seat pockets, trunk. Nothing interesting. Just an umbrella, several bottles of expensive water, a first aid kit that looked like it had never been opened. Dylan drove to the address Helen had given him, an upscale restaurant in the financial district, the kind of place where reservations had to be made months in advance, and the cheapest entree cost what Dylan spent on groceries for a week. He arrived exactly on time and pulled into the VIP waiting area. A valet started to approach, saw the Drake Technologies emblem on the car, and immediately stepped back with a deferential nod. At 7:15, the restaurant doors opened. Vanessa emerged with two other people. A man in his 40s wearing a watch that probably cost more than Dylan's car would have if he owned one, and a woman Dylan recognized from company photos as Patricia Voss, one of Drake Technologies' board members. They were deep in conversation, Vanessa's expression more animated than Dylan had ever seen it. She actually smiled at something the man said, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. Dylan got out and opened the rear door. The three of them climbed in, still talking, not acknowledging him beyond Patricia briefly glancing in his direction. Dylan closed the door and got behind the wheel, started the engine, and pulled smoothly into traffic. Completely unrealistic timeline, Patricia was saying, her voice carrying the edge of someone who'd been having this argument for a while. The regulatory approval alone will take 6 months minimum, Vanessa. You know that. We don't need regulatory approval if we're conducting trials in international waters, Vanessa replied, her voice shifting back to that cold precision Dylan recognized from the phone call last time. We've been over this, Patricia, multiple times. International waters? The man laughed, but it sounded nervous, uncertain. You're serious? Completely. We have a facility ready to go. It's already staffed with the personnel we need. We move Phase 4 trials offshore. We cut the timeline in half and eliminate the oversight complications that have been slowing us down. Patricia made a sound somewhere between disbelief and resignation. The optics of that are terrible. If the media gets wind, the optics don't matter if nobody knows about it, and nobody will know about it because we're not going to tell them. Vanessa's voice was matter-of-fact, like she was discussing something as mundane as office supplies. The research happens quietly. We get the results we need. And by the time anyone asks questions, we're already at market with a product that changes everything. Dylan kept his eyes on the road, hands steady on the wheel, but every sense was tuned to the conversation happening behind him. He adjusted the rearview mirror slightly, just enough to see their reflections. The man spoke again, quieter now. What about the families? After what happened in Phase 3, with the complications, the families were compensated. Vanessa cut him off, her tone suggesting this topic was closed. Generously, they signed NDAs with terms that would bankrupt them for 3 generations if they violate confidentiality. It's handled, David. People died, Vanessa. People die in clinical trials all the time. It's an acceptable level of risk for the potential breakthrough we're looking at. Her voice didn't waver, didn't soften, even slightly. If you're having second thoughts about your investment, David, now's the time to say so. Before we move into Phase 4 and the stakes get higher. Silence filled the car for a long moment. Dylan watched David's reflection in the mirror. The man was staring out the window, jaw tight. Then David spoke, quieter. No second thoughts. I'm in. Good. Then we move forward as planned. Patricia, I need the board vote by Friday. Can you deliver that? I can try. Some of them are still nervous about, don't try. Do it. This is too important to let bureaucracy slow us down. Vanessa's voice had steel in it now. We're talking about technology that will revolutionize neural interfaces, that will make everything we've done so far look like child's play. The people who get squeamish about acceptable risk don't belong in this industry. The conversation shifted to logistics after that. Budgets, timelines, technical specifications Dylan only half understood, but he'd heard enough. Phase 4 trials. International waters. Board vote on Friday. Lily's death hadn't been an isolated incident or a one-time cover-up. It was part of something bigger, something ongoing, something that was about to expand into new territory where oversight didn't exist. Dylan pulled up to Vanessa's building and stopped at the private elevator entrance. The 3 of them got out, still deep in discussion, not sparing him a glance. He was furniture, invisible. He watched them disappear into the elevator, watched the doors close on Vanessa's profile as she checked her phone. Then he sat there in the car, hands trembling slightly on the wheel, trying to process what he'd just heard. Vanessa Drake wasn't just covering up past crimes. She was planning new ones. More trials, more risk, more people who might end up like Lily, listed in a file somewhere as an acceptable loss. Dylan drove back to the garage, parked the car, and returned the keys. Rode the subway home in a daze, the city lights blurring past the windows. Mrs. Calloway was waiting when he got back to the apartment. Emma's asleep, she said gently, studying his face with concern. You look exhausted, Dylan. Everything all right? Yeah, just long day, work stuff. She gave him that look again, the one that said she knew something was wrong but wouldn't push unless he wanted to talk. You sure, dear? You know you can always… I'm fine. Really. Thank you for watching her. After Mrs. Calloway left, Dylan checked on Emma, still asleep, peaceful, one arm thrown over her stuffed rabbit, and then collapsed on the couch. He pulled out his phone and opened his notes app, started writing down everything he remembered from the conversation. Names, dates, details. Every word he could recall. International waters, Phase 4. Board vote Friday. He had 3 days. 3 days to figure out how to stop this before more people died the way Lily had. 3 days to become someone Vanessa Drake would actually notice as more than just a driver. The old version of himself, the one who'd understood strategy and manipulation and how to move pieces on a board most people couldn't even see, was waking up after 3 years of sleep. And it turned out he remembered exactly how to play. The next morning, Dylan called in sick to work for the first time in 2 years. He stood in the bathroom with his phone pressed to his ear, listening to Marcus's voicemail greeting play through twice before leaving a message about a stomach bug that had kept him up all night. His reflection in the mirror looked exactly how he needed it to look. Exhausted, hollowed out, believable. The dark circles under his eyes were real enough. He'd been awake most of the night, mind racing through scenarios and strategies, building a plan that was still more skeleton than fully formed idea. After dropping Emma at school with an extra-long hug that made her giggle and squirm away, Dylan came back to the empty apartment and got to work. He spent the entire day at his laptop, diving into research he should have done 3 years ago when grief hadn't completely paralyzed him. Maritime law and how it applied to medical research. International regulations on clinical trials. or more accurately, the lack of regulations once you move beyond territorial waters. Corporate liability in international waters. He pulled up maps of offshore research facilities, read articles about pharmaceutical companies that had quietly moved controversial testing beyond the reach of regulatory bodies when domestic oversight became too restrictive. The rabbit hole went deeper than he'd expected, darker than he'd imagined, even after everything he'd already learned. Companies that had faced lawsuits for trials that went wrong on foreign soil, only to settle quietly with ND, as that buried the truth. Research that would be illegal in the United States happening on ships or artificial islands where no one's laws quite applied. The gray zones where money and ambition operated without the inconvenience of ethics committees or informed consent protocols that actually meant anything. By evening, his laptop screen was covered in open tabs, and his notebook was filled with scribbled connections, arrows linking names to dates to events. He had names of Drake Technologies board members, cross-referenced with their investment portfolios and previous business ventures. Timelines showing when Phase 3 had ended, around the time Lily died, he noted with a hollow feeling in his chest, and when Phase 4 was scheduled to begin. Financial records he'd pulled from public SEC filings that showed money moving in patterns that didn't quite make sense unless you knew what to look for. Shell companies and offshore accounts that funneled funding to research divisions that didn't officially exist. But he still didn't have the one thing that mattered most. Hard evidence. Documentation that would stand up under scrutiny, that couldn't be dismissed as circumstantial or explained away by expensive lawyers who specialized in making problems disappear. He needed access to Finch's research files, to the actual trial data showing what had happened to participants, to the internal communications that would prove intent, planning, knowledge of the risks they were taking with human lives, and a deliberate decision to proceed anyway. And he needed it before Friday's board vote that Vanessa had mentioned in the car. Dylan picked Emma up from school, made her macaroni and cheese for dinner because it was easy, and she loved it, helped her sound out words in her reading homework, sounding more patient than he felt. Tucked her into bed and kissed her forehead, breathing in the familiar strawberry scent of her shampoo and letting it ground him for a moment. "Love you, Bug." "Love you too, Daddy. Are you feeling better? Mrs. Rodriguez said you were sick." He managed what he hoped was a reassuring smile. "Yeah, much better. Just needed to rest." "Good. I don't like when you're sick." "I know, sweetheart. Get some sleep." After she fell asleep, Dylan went back to his laptop and started mapping out the next phase with more clarity. He couldn't do this alone, couldn't hack into secure corporate systems or break into offices without getting caught. He didn't have those skills, and hiring someone who did would leave a trail he couldn't afford. But he could use what he was actually good at: reading people, finding leverage, exploiting weaknesses in human systems rather than digital ones. Social engineering, they called it in the security world. The art of making people want to give you access instead of having to take it by force. Thursday morning, he went back to work. Marcus looked up when Dylan arrived at his desk, coffee in hand. "You look like hell." "Thanks. Feeling better, though." "Good, because we're drowning here. Finch's office has been requesting data pulls every 2 hours since yesterday morning. Apparently you made quite an impression up there." Dylan's pulse quickened, but he kept his expression neutral, mildly curious. "You say what he needs?" Historical budget comparisons going back 7 years. Revenue projections broken down by quarter. Cost analysis for the entire research division with subcategory breakdowns. Marcus dumped a stack of request forms on Dylan's desk with a thud. "He specifically asked for you to handle it. Said something about you understanding the system better than anyone else he's worked with." "I can do that." "You better. He's got some big presentation next week, and apparently the numbers need to be perfect or heads are going to roll." Marcus was already walking away, distracted by his phone, then stopped and turned back. "Oh, and he wants you to deliver them in person when you're done. 9th floor, same as before. Guess you made a friend up there." Dylan nodded, already opening the first request and pulling up the database access he needed. This was exactly the opening he'd been hoping for. Legitimate access to data, a valid reason to be in contact with Finch's office, an opportunity to observe and learn the landscape without raising any suspicion. The old version of himself, the one who'd worked in environments where information was currency and access was everything, would have called it operational positioning. The current version just called it incredibly lucky timing. He worked through the requests methodically over the next several hours, pulling numbers from databases he knew better than most people in the department because he'd actually bothered to learn the architecture instead of just running basic queries. But while he worked, he was also looking for patterns, anomalies, anything that might give him a window into what Finch was actually doing with all this money. The research division's budget had tripled in the past 3 years, a massive increase that should have raised questions but apparently hadn't. Revenue projections assumed a major product launch within 18 months that would generate returns in the billions, which meant they were confident Phase 4 would succeed. Cost analysis showed enormous expenditures on facilities, specialized personnel, and equipment that didn't match up with any publicly announced projects Drake Technologies had in development. It was all legal on paper, structured carefully to pass audit scrutiny. But the numbers told a different story if you knew how to read between the lines. A story about a company betting everything on research that was happening in shadows, far from public view. By mid-afternoon, Dylan had everything Finch requested compiled onto a secure flash drive, organized exactly how the request form specified. He saved a complete copy for himself on a personal encrypted drive he kept hidden in the back of his desk drawer, then headed for the elevator. The 9th floor felt different this time. Less intimidating, more familiar. Dylan nodded at a few people he vaguely recognized from his previous visit and made his way down the glass-walled corridor to Finch's corner office. Jennifer looked up from her desk when he approached, and recognition flickered across her face immediately. "Mr. Cross? Dr. Finch is expecting you?" "Got the data he requested." She gestured towards the office door without the skepticism she'd shown on his first visit. "Go ahead in. He's between calls right now." Dylan knocked once and entered when he heard Finch's voice tell him to come in. The office still impressed him despite himself. Expensive furniture that looked comfortable rather than showy, walls lined with framed degrees from Stanford and MIT, and awards from medical journals Dylan had actually heard of. The view through the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the city in a way that reminded you exactly how high up you were, how far there was to fall. Finch himself sat behind his massive desk, reading glasses perched on his nose, reviewing something on his computer screen with the intense focus of someone who'd found a problem they needed to solve. He looked up when Dylan entered. "Mr. Cross, you have the data?" "Everything you requested, sir." Dylan held up the flash drive. Historical budgets, revenue projections, cost analysis going back 7 years with all the subcategory breakdowns you specified. Finch held out his hand and Dylan crossed the office, using the opportunity to glance casually at what was on the computer screen. Looked like a presentation deck, slides with charts and graphs he couldn't quite make out from this angle, but that had the polished look of something being prepared for important eyes. "This is complete?" Finch asked, already plugging the drive into his computer with the impatience of someone working against a tight deadline. "Yes, sir. I cross-referenced everything against 3 different databases to verify accuracy. The numbers are solid." Finch pulled up the files, clicking through folders and scanning their contents with practiced speed. His expression remained carefully neutral, but Dylan caught the slight nod, the almost imperceptible relaxation of shoulders that suggested relief. "Good. This is exactly what I needed. Clean formatting, too. I can drop these straight into the presentation deck without reformatting." "That was the idea, sir. Figured it would save you time." Finch looked at him then, really looked, with that same assessing gaze from their first meeting, like he was trying to figure out what Dylan actually was beneath the surface. "Marcus tells me you're one of his most reliable people. Says in 2 years you've never missed a deadline or made an error that had to be corrected." "I try not to, sir." "How long have you been in budgeting?" 2 years here at Drake Technologies. Did similar analytical work before that." "You like it?" The question caught Dylan off guard. He'd expected dismissal after delivering the data, maybe a perfunctory thanks and a wave toward the door. Not actual conversation. "It's steady work, pays the bills." "That's not what I asked." Dylan met his eyes directly, made a split-second decision about how to play this. Honesty, but the calculated kind that served a purpose. "It's fine. It's what I can handle right now given my situation, but I'm capable of more than reconciling expense reports." Something shifted in Finch's expression. Interest, maybe. Or the kind of calculation that came from years of evaluating people for positions they didn't know they were being considered for. "What are you capable of?" "Strategic analysis, pattern recognition, systems thinking." Dylan kept his voice level, confident but not arrogant. The budget work is just numbers and columns. I can do that in my sleep at this point. But if you need someone who can actually interpret what those numbers mean, draw conclusions from data sets, identify risks or opportunities that aren't immediately obvious, that's where my actual skills are. Finch leaned back in his leather chair, fingers steepled under his chin, in a gesture that suggested he was genuinely thinking rather than just going through conversational motions. You're ambitious. I'm practical. I have skills that are currently being wasted on work that doesn't require them. And you think you should be doing something more important. I think everyone should be doing work that actually uses their abilities instead of just filling time. Dylan paused, gauging Finch's reaction, then took another calculated risk. I spent years before this analyzing complex systems, predicting outcomes, managing risk in high-stakes environments. This job pays my bills and gives me the stability I need as a single father. But it doesn't challenge me, doesn't engage the parts of my brain that are good at solving real problems. So when I get a chance to do something that actually requires strategic thinking, like pulling this data for you in a way that's immediately useful instead of just technically accurate, it's the first time I've felt genuinely engaged at work in months. It was true, mostly. True enough that it sounded genuine, had the ring of real frustration rather than rehearsed complaint. Finch studied him for a long moment, the kind of silence that felt evaluative rather than awkward. You have a daughter. Dylan blinked, caught off guard by the shift. Yes, sir. I did my homework after you were here on Monday. Wanted to know who I was potentially working with. Finch's tone was matter-of-fact, almost apologetic, but not quite. Single father. Wife died 3 years ago in a car accident. No extended family support system to speak of. You're doing this completely alone. Dylan's jaw tightened involuntarily, but he kept his voice steady. That's right. Must be incredibly hard. We manage. I respect that tremendously. Taking care of your kid, showing up every day, doing work that's beneath your abilities because it's what's available and stable. Finch pulled off his reading glasses, set them carefully on the desk. How old is she? 6? Good age. Still young enough to think you're a superhero who can fix anything. A slight smile crossed Finch's face, the first real warmth Dylan had seen from him. I have 2 boys. Teenagers now. They mostly just think I'm embarrassing and wrong about everything. Dylan found himself almost liking the man, which made everything significantly harder. Finch wasn't some cartoon villain twirling a mustache. He was just a person, someone with kids he clearly cared about, and probably troubles of his own. Someone who'd likely rationalized whatever role he played in Project Sentinel as necessary for scientific progress, or the greater good, or whatever story people told themselves to sleep at night. That was the thing about evil Dylan had learned over the years. It rarely looked like evil from the inside. It looked like difficult choices and acceptable risks, and the ends justifying the means. Listen, Finch said, leaning forward with his elbows on the desk. I've got a presentation Tuesday morning that's absolutely crucial to some major funding decisions. We're asking the board for significant resources to move forward with the next phase of a research project that could genuinely change the landscape of neural interface technology. But the financial case needs to be airtight because we're talking about serious money and serious scrutiny. Dylan nodded, keeping his expression interested but neutral. I could use someone with your skill set to help me prepare. The kind of strategic analysis you were talking about, looking at the numbers and telling me what story they're actually telling, where the weak points in my argument are, what questions the board might ask that I haven't anticipated. Finch paused. It would be intensive work, long hours between now and Tuesday, but it would give you a chance to do the kind of work you're actually good at instead of expense reconciliation. Dylan's heart was racing, but he kept his expression thoughtful, like he was genuinely considering an unexpected offer. What kind of project is this? Biomedical research. Experimental neural interface technology with applications in everything from prosthetics to cognitive enhancement. It's highly technical, extremely complicated, but the financial side needs to be bulletproof because we're asking for a budget increase that will raise eyebrows. How significant an increase? $800 million over the next 2 years. Dylan let out a low whistle, genuine surprise at the scale. That's a serious investment. It's a serious project with serious potential, game-changing if we get it right. Finch paused, watching Dylan's reaction carefully. I can't give you details about the actual research. Most of this is confidential and well above your current clearance level, but I can give you the financial data, the projections, the budget models, and you can help me make sure the business case is absolutely bulletproof. Interested? This was it. The access Dylan needed, handed to him on a silver platter wrapped in professional opportunity. He let himself appear to think about it for a few seconds, then nodded. Absolutely interested, sir. When would you need me to start? Tomorrow morning. Clear your schedule for the next 4 days. You'll be working directly with me and my senior team, essentially full-time until the presentation Tuesday. I'll handle Marcus and make sure you're officially assigned to this project. I appreciate the opportunity, Dr. Finch. Don't thank me yet. You're going to earn every bit of it. Finch stood, extending his hand across the desk. Welcome to Advanced Research, Mr. Cross. Even if it's just temporary, I have a feeling you're going to make quite an impression. Dylan shook his hand, feeling the weight of what he'd just stepped into settling across his shoulders. He left Finch's office with instructions to report back at 8 the next morning and took the elevator down in a kind of daze. This was moving faster than he'd anticipated, more smoothly than he'd planned for. Dangerous, because smooth meant he might be missing something, but exactly what he needed to get close enough to find real evidence. Back at his desk on the 3rd floor, Dylan's hands were shaking slightly as he logged into his computer. He had 4 days embedded with Finch's team, 4 days with access to data and people and conversations that could give him what he needed to understand the full scope of Project Sentinel and potentially stop Phase 4 before it started. 4 days to find concrete evidence that Lily hadn't died in a random accident. 4 days to position himself as someone useful enough that Vanessa Drake would actually notice him instead of looking straight through him. His phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Dr. Finch has requested you be temporarily assigned to advanced research effective immediately. Report to his office tomorrow 8 a.m. Security clearance upgrade pending approval. Helen Ortiz, Chief of Staff. Dylan stared at the message. Helen Ortiz, Vanessa Drake's right hand, the woman who controlled access to the executive suite. Which meant Vanessa knew his name now. Had probably approved the clearance upgrade herself, or at least been briefed on personnel changes in her research division. He wasn't invisible anymore. The realization sent a thrill of something like fear mixed with anticipation through his chest. He'd wanted this, needed this, but now that it was happening, the magnitude of what he was attempting felt suddenly very real. Dylan spent the rest of the afternoon finishing his regular work and sending handoff emails to Marcus about projects that would need coverage while he was assigned elsewhere. Marcus responded with barely concealed irritation that he was losing his most reliable analyst for a week, but there wasn't anything he could do about it when the request came from Dr. Finch. That evening, Dylan picked Emma up from Mrs. Calloway's apartment where she'd been doing homework and eating fresh-baked cookies. Daddy, Mrs. Calloway taught me how to make chocolate chip cookies. Can we make them at home? Sure, Bug, this weekend. Back at their apartment, Dylan made dinner while Emma chattered about her day, about the science project her class was starting, about how Tommy Fletcher had gotten in trouble for throwing erasers. He listened with half his attention while the other half spun through scenarios for the next 4 days. After Emma was asleep, Dylan sat on the couch with his laptop and started doing research on the people he'd be working with. Dr. Sarah Reeves, Finch's deputy director, had published extensively on neural interface protocols before joining Drake Technologies. The 2 analysts on the team were younger, recent PhDs from prestigious programs. All brilliant, all invested in making Project Sentinel succeed, all potentially complicit in covering up deaths if they knew what had happened in Phase 3. Dylan needed to remember that. These weren't just colleagues he'd be working with. They were people who might have known about Lily, about the others who'd died, and chosen to stay silent. Friday morning arrived cold and clear. Dylan dropped Emma at school early, arrived at Drake Technologies at 7:30 wearing his better suit, the one he'd bought for Lily's funeral and barely worn since because he never went anywhere that required it. The 9th floor felt different in the early morning, quieter but with an undercurrent of purposeful energy. Dylan found Finch's office and was directed by Jennifer to a large conference room down the hall where 3 other people were already set up and working. 2 men who looked like they hadn't slept properly in days hunched over laptops surrounded by empty coffee cups. A woman in her 30s with dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail looked up from a massive spreadsheet when Dylan entered. "You're the budget guy?" she asked, looking him over with the kind of immediate skepticism that suggested she'd been promised help before and been disappointed. Dylan Cross. Dr. Finch asked me to help with the financial analysis for Tuesday's presentation. Right. Garrett mentioned you. She stood and extended her hand. Dr. Sarah Reeves, Deputy Director. These are James and Michael. They handle data analysis and modeling. The two men nodded without looking up from their screens. Sarah gestured at an empty chair at the conference table. Sit. We've got an enormous amount to cover and not nearly enough time to do it properly, so we're going to have to move fast. Over the next 4 days, Dylan absorbed everything he could while maintaining the careful mask of someone just doing a job they were grateful to have. He reviewed financial projections that assumed Phase 4 would produce breakthrough results within 12 months. Analyzed cost structures that included facility operations in the Bahamas. There it was. Confirmation of what Vanessa had mentioned in the car. Participated in strategy sessions about how to frame the funding request to make it seem like the obvious choice rather than the massive risk it actually was. And he listened. Sarah complained frequently about timeline pressures that didn't account for scientific reality. One of the analysts mentioned data gaps from Phase 3 that were making their statistical projections less reliable than anyone wanted to admit. Finch spent hours on phone calls with someone about facility readiness and permitting issues that apparently weren't resolved yet. The Bahamas facility. International waters. Exactly where Vanessa had said the Phase 4 trials would happen, beyond the reach of FDA oversight. Dylan took extensive notes ostensibly about budget allocations and revenue models, but actually cataloging everything he heard that might be useful later. Names, dates, details about how the operation actually functioned. He worked 18-hour days, barely seeing Emma except for rushed breakfasts before school. Mrs. Calloway covered afternoons and evenings without complaint, seeming to understand that something important was happening even if Dylan couldn't explain what. On Sunday evening, working late in the conference room while the others had finally gone home to sleep, Dylan found the opportunity he'd been watching for. Sarah had left her laptop logged in when she stepped out for what she said would be a quick dinner run to the Thai place down the street. The door to Finch's office was closed but unlocked. He'd left an hour earlier after a tense phone call about something related to equipment delays. Dylan stood slowly, stretched like his back was sore from sitting too long, and walked casually to the windows overlooking the city. Checked the hallway through the glass walls. Empty. The 9th floor on Sunday night at 8 p.m. was deserted except for him. He moved quickly but carefully. Finch's office first, closing the door most of the way behind him so it wouldn't look obviously shut. The computer was locked with a password Dylan didn't have and couldn't guess, but he wasn't after digital files that would leave access logs. He opened desk drawers methodically, finding them mostly mundane. Office supplies, business cards, a framed photo of 2 teenage boys at what looked like a soccer game. But in the bottom drawer, underneath a stack of old medical journals, was a folder. Thin, unlabeled, the kind of thing you'd miss if you weren't specifically searching. Dylan pulled it out carefully. Inside were printed emails, hard copies of correspondence that apparently hadn't been filed digitally or had been deliberately kept off servers. He scanned them quickly, phone out, photographing each page. One email from Vanessa to Finch dated 8 months ago. Phase 3 complications are unfortunate but not unexpected given the experimental nature of the protocols. Proceed with participant compensation packages and NDA enforcement as discussed. Begin Phase 4 planning immediately. Timeline is critical for maintaining our competitive position. Another from Finch to someone named Morrison. We've had 3 adverse events this quarter. 2 resolved with medical intervention, 1 resulted in participant death. Family has been contacted and terms agreed to. Recommend adjusting protocols before next trial phase to reduce cardiovascular risk factors. Dylan's hands were perfectly steady photographing the pages, but his heart was pounding so hard he could feel it in his throat. This was it. Documentary evidence of knowledge, of deliberate decisions, of a pattern they were trying to hide. He heard footsteps in the hallway outside. Dylan shoved the folder back exactly how he'd found it, closed the drawer silently, and was walking toward the conference room when Sarah appeared in the hallway carrying plastic bags that smelled like pad thai. Still here? You're either incredibly dedicated or you don't have a life. She said it with a slight smile that took the edge off. Just wanted to finish the sensitivity analysis before tomorrow. Dylan gestured at his laptop in the conference room where his work was actually still displayed on screen. Almost done. Good. Garrett wants everything ready for a final review at 6 a.m. tomorrow. She dropped the bags on the conference table. Got you a spring roll and some chicken sauté. Figured you probably haven't eaten actual food in hours. Thanks. That's really thoughtful. They worked together for another hour, Dylan asking questions about the research timeline that seemed relevant to budget planning, but were actually filling in gaps in his understanding of how Project Sentinel actually operated, how participants were recruited, what the screening process looked like, how they tracked outcomes. By the time he left at 10:30, he had photographs of incriminating documents on his phone and a significantly clearer picture of the scope of what Vanessa was planning. Monday was a controlled chaos of final preparations. The presentation deck was refined, rehearsed, questioned from every angle, and improved. Finch ran them through mock board questions, pushing back aggressively on every assumption until the financial case was absolutely ironclad. Dylan played his part perfectly. The sharp analyst who caught small errors before they became problems, who anticipated concerns, who made the numbers tell exactly the story Finch needed them to tell, without technically lying. You're genuinely good at this, Sarah said during a late afternoon break when they were alone in the conference room. Why have you been wasting your time in budgeting? Dylan went with the truth, or close enough. Needed stable work after my wife died. Didn't have the energy for anything more demanding than spreadsheets. She nodded with what looked like genuine sympathy. And now? Now I think I'm ready for something that actually uses my brain again. Monday evening, after the final rehearsal went smoothly, Finch called everyone together in the conference room. Tomorrow morning, 8 o'clock, we present to the full board. This is the most important pitch advanced research has ever made. His voice was serious, the weight of it clear. If we get approval for this funding, we'll have everything we need to complete Phase 4 and move to market within 18 months. If we don't... He stopped. Didn't finish the sentence. Didn't need to. Everyone understood what was at stake. Their careers, the research they'd invested years in, everything they'd worked for. After the meeting dissolved, people gathering their things to finally go home, Finch pulled Dylan aside. You've been invaluable this week. However this goes tomorrow, I'm putting in a formal request to have you transferred to my team permanently. You're completely wasted where Marcus has you. Dylan felt the bitter irony like a physical taste. I appreciate that, sir. This has been the most engaged I've felt at work in years. You've earned it. Now go home, get some actual sleep. Tomorrow we change everything. Dylan nodded and left, but he didn't go straight home. Instead, he walked through the city for an hour, phone in his pocket containing photographs of documents that proved Vanessa Drake knew exactly what she was doing, that she'd personally ordered the cover-up of deaths in Phase 3, including Lily's, that she was planning to expand illegal trials beyond the reach of any regulatory oversight. He had evidence now. Not everything he might need for a criminal prosecution, but enough to prove a pattern, enough to show intent. The question burning in his mind was what to do with it. Going to the police was still risky. Vanessa had resources and connections that could make evidence disappear, could make him look like a disgruntled employee with a grudge. The media was a possibility if he could find a reporter willing to go up against Drake Technologies' legal team in deep pockets. Or he could do something else entirely, something the old version of himself would have done. He could take what he knew, what he'd learned about how Vanessa operated and how her empire functioned, and use it to systematically dismantle everything she'd built. Not just expose her crimes, but destroy her power base piece by piece, turn her own board against her, make her lose everything the way he'd lost everything. Dylan stood on a street corner watching traffic flow past in rivers of light and made his decision. Tomorrow morning, he'd sit in that board meeting. He'd watch Vanessa operate in her natural environment. He'd learn exactly how she controlled powerful people, how she manipulated rooms full of executives who thought they were the smartest people in the world. And then he'd use every bit of that knowledge to take her apart. By the time Dylan got home, it was after midnight. He picked up Emma from Mrs. Calloway's apartment where she'd fallen asleep on the couch. Big day tomorrow? Mrs. Calloway asked quietly while Dylan gathered Emma's backpack and shoes. Yeah, important presentation. You'll do wonderfully. You always do. If she only knew what he was actually planning. Dylan carried Emma home and tucked her into bed without waking her. Then he sat in the dark apartment, laptop open, and started writing. Not just scattered notes anymore, but an actual plan with stages and contingencies and moves mapped out several steps ahead. The underdog wasn't just rising anymore. He was becoming something Vanessa Drake had never anticipated, would never see coming until it was far too late. A threat with nothing left to lose and everything to fight for. Tuesday morning arrived with rain hammering against the windows like it was trying to break through. Dylan dressed in his best suit, the funeral suit, and took extra care with his appearance. Dropped Emma at school early with a promise to make it home for dinner tonight no matter what. "You look really fancy, Daddy, like you're going somewhere super important." He crouched down to her level, adjusting her backpack straps. "Big meeting at work, Bug. Probably the biggest one I'll ever be in. Are you nervous?" "A little bit." She hugged him tight, her small arms fierce around his neck. "You're going to do great. You always do everything great." If she only knew what he was walking into. Dylan arrived at Drake Technologies at 7:15. The 9th floor was already humming with nervous energy. Finch and his team were doing final run-throughs in the conference room, checking every slide, rehearsing answers to potential questions they might have missed. At 7:50, Helen Ortiz appeared in the doorway. "Dr. Finch, the board is assembled. They're ready in conference room A." Everyone gathered their materials in silence, the weight of the moment suddenly very real. Dylan followed the group down the hallway, heart pounding steadily. Conference room A was exactly what you'd expect for a billion-dollar company's board meetings. Massive table that could seat 30 people. Leather chairs that probably cost more than Dylan's monthly rent. Windows overlooking the city from a height that made everything below look insignificant. Board members were already taking their seats. Men and women in expensive suits, faces Dylan recognized from corporate websites and business magazine profiles. Old money and new money. Strategic investors and industry veterans, the kind of people who decided the fates of companies with a vote. And at the head of the table, reviewing something on her tablet with absolute focus, was Vanessa Drake. She looked up as they entered, her eyes scanning the group efficiently. Paused very briefly on Dylan with a flicker of something that might have been mild curiosity, awareness that he was new, not someone she'd seen in these meetings before. Then she looked away, back to her tablet, already dismissing him as unimportant. Finch moved to the front of the room where a presentation screen dominated one wall. Dylan took a seat in the back row with Sarah and the analysts, positioned where he could see everything. "Good morning," Finch began, his voice confident and clear. "Thank you all for making time for this presentation. What we're about to show you represents a breakthrough that will fundamentally change Drake Technologies' position in the neural interface market." The presentation began. Charts and graphs appeared on the screen showing market projections, competitive analysis, technical specifications simplified for a non-scientific audience. Finch was genuinely good at this, commanding the room's attention, making complex research sound both understandable and inevitable. The board asked questions, sharp ones. Finch answered them smoothly. Sarah jumped in when technical details needed clarification. Dylan watched Vanessa. She sat perfectly still at the head of the table, face completely unreadable, asking questions that were sharper and more penetrating than anyone else's. Questions that cut directly to the heart of assumptions and risks everyone else was dancing around. "What's the realistic timeline for FDA approval once trials are complete?" she asked. 18 to 24 months based on current regulatory frameworks, Finch replied. "And if we encounter delays or complications in the approval process? We've built substantial contingencies into the budget to account for extended timelines." Vanessa's eyes narrowed slightly. "Show me the specific contingencies." Dylan stood before anyone else could respond. "Ma'am, if I may, I prepared a detailed analysis of timeline risks and their financial impacts." Vanessa's eyes locked onto him, really seeing him for the first time. "Who are you?" "Dylan Cross, ma'am. I've been working with Dr. Finch's team on the financial modeling and risk analysis." "Show me." Dylan walked to the front of the room with his laptop, pulled up the slide deck he'd prepared specifically for questions like this, connected to the main display and walked them through the sensitivity analysis, the risk mitigation strategies, the financial buffers built into every phase of the budget. She studied the numbers in silence for what felt like an eternity, then nodded once. "Acceptable? Continue." He'd done it. Vanessa Drake not only knew his name now, she'd seen him perform under pressure. And she had absolutely no idea that the competent analyst standing in front of her board was the same man who was going to systematically destroy everything she'd built. The meeting continued for another hour. Questions, answers, debates about technical feasibility, and market positioning. At the end, Finch made his final pitch for the $800 million in funding. "This is our moment," he said. "We either move forward with the resources to do this right, or we watch our competitors beat us to market with inferior technology. The choice is yours." The board voted. One by one, hands raised around the table. Unanimous approval. $800 million for Phase 4. Finch was visibly relieved. Sarah was grinning. Board members were already standing and moving on to their next meeting. Dylan stood in the back of the room, watching Vanessa gather her tablet and papers with efficient movements. She'd won this round, gotten everything she wanted, but the game was just beginning, and she had no idea she'd just invited her own destruction into the inner circle. The board meeting ended and people filed out in clusters, their voices carrying down the hallway in conversations about quarterly targets and strategic positioning. Dylan stayed in his seat at the back of the room, organizing papers he'd already organized twice, watching Vanessa through the thinning crowd. She stood at the head of the table in conversation with Patricia Voss, their heads bent close together, discussing something that made Patricia's expression tighten with concern. Finch was across the room shaking hands with another board member, his relief visible in the way his shoulders had finally relaxed after days of tension. Sarah had already disappeared, probably heading back to their conference room to start mapping out Phase 4 logistics. The two analysts were packing up laptops with the slightly dazed expressions of people who'd been running on caffeine and adrenaline for too long. Dylan pulled out his phone, pretending to scroll through messages while he actually observed the room's dynamics. This was what power looked like when you got close enough to see it clearly. Not dramatic or flashy like movies suggested, just people in expensive clothes making decisions that would affect thousands of lives they'd never meet, never have to look in the eye. "Mr. Cross?" Dylan looked up sharply. Vanessa was standing right in front of him. He hadn't heard her approach, hadn't noticed her crossing the room. "Yes, ma'am? That risk analysis you presented earlier, you built that model yourself?" "Yes, ma'am. Dr. Finch asked me to run different scenarios and map their financial impacts across various timelines." She studied him with those sharp eyes that seemed to catalog details most people would miss. "You're not from the research division originally." "No, ma'am. I work in budgeting. Worked there, I should say. Dr. Finch brought me in for this project last week." "What did you do before Drake Technologies?" The question felt loaded somehow, like a test Dylan hadn't studied for. He kept his voice steady, his story simple and close to the truth. "Risk analysis and strategic planning for a consulting firm. Nothing as high level as this work." "Why'd you leave consulting?" "My wife died. I needed something with more predictable hours so I could take care of my daughter." The words came easier than they used to, worn smooth by repetition. Something flickered across Vanessa's face, too quick for Dylan to read properly. Sympathy? Calculation? "I'm sorry for your loss." "Thank you, ma'am. Dr. Finch is requesting that your transfer to advanced research be made permanent. I'm approving it." She said it matter-of-factly, the same tone she might use to approve a supply order. "Helen will process the paperwork today. You'll report directly to Dr. Finch starting next Monday with a salary adjustment commensurate with the position." Dylan felt his pulse spike hard but forced his expression to stay professionally grateful. "I appreciate the opportunity, ma'am. I won't let you down. Don't thank me yet. Thank Dr. Finch for recognizing talent when he sees it." She turned to leave, then paused and looked back at him. "Your wife. How did she die exactly?" The question hit like a physical blow to the chest. Dylan forced himself to breathe normally, to keep his voice level and steady. "Car accident. Mechanical failure. The brakes gave out on a hill." Vanessa nodded slowly, her expression unreadable. Terrible. The randomness of it, how quickly everything can change. Then she walked away, heels clicking against the polished floor, already moving on to whatever came next in her carefully scheduled day. Dylan sat frozen in his chair, heart hammering so hard he could feel it in his throat. Did she know? Had that been a test? A way of telling him she knew exactly who he was and what had happened to Lily? Or was it just a question, the kind powerful people sometimes asked when they wanted to seem human for 30 seconds before forgetting you existed? He couldn't tell, and not being able to tell was dangerous. Dylan gathered his laptop and notebook with hands that wanted to shake but didn't, left the conference room, and headed back toward the smaller meeting space where his team worked. His mind was racing through scenarios. If Vanessa suspected something, she'd start digging. And if she dug deep enough, she'd find connections. His wife's death 3 years ago. Her work as an investigative journalist, the story she'd been chasing about Drake Technologies before she died. He needed to be more careful. One wrong move and everything would collapse. Sarah was already at her laptop when Dylan entered the conference room, typing with the focused intensity of someone who'd just gotten marching orders. There you are. Garrett wants us moving on Phase 4 prep immediately. Board approval means we're full speed ahead starting today. She looked up, flashed him a quick grin. Also, congratulations on making it official. Heard Vanessa personally approved your transfer. Welcome to advanced research permanently. News travels fast around here. Helen sent the announcement email about 10 minutes ago. You're official as of Monday. Sarah gestured at an empty chair. Sit down, we've got facility logistics to finalize and a participant recruitment timeline to nail down. The next 3 months are going to be absolutely insane. Dylan sat, pulled out his laptop, and slipped smoothly back into the role of helpful analyst. But his mind was operating on multiple levels now, cataloging every piece of information Sarah shared while simultaneously planning how to use it. The Bahamas facility would be fully operational in 6 weeks, she explained. They needed 40 participants total for Phase 4, would start recruitment through the same channels they'd used for previous trials. Targeted advertisements in medical research volunteer databases, outreach through university programs that connected students with paid studies, referrals from physicians who'd worked with Drake Technologies before. What about Phase 3 participants? Dylan asked, keeping his tone casually curious. Do we follow up with them for testimonials, use them to help recruit the next group? Sarah's expression tightened almost imperceptibly, a micro-expression that confirmed what Dylan already suspected. Phase 3 had some complications that made ongoing relationships with participants difficult. We compensated everyone generously, and most signed confidentiality agreements as part of their participation terms. Standard protocol for experimental medical research. Makes sense. Don't want to bias the incoming group or create unrealistic expectations about outcomes. Exactly right. She went back to her spreadsheet, the conversation effectively closed, but Dylan had learned what he needed to know. They weren't using Phase 3 participants as success stories because there were no success stories to use. Just complications and NDAs and families who'd been paid substantial sums to stay quiet about what had really happened. The afternoon dissolved into logistics planning and timeline mapping. Dylan participated fully, asked smart questions that made him look engaged, made himself useful in ways that would be remembered, all while his phone sat in his pocket containing photographs of documents that proved everything Sarah was so carefully not saying out loud. By 6 o'clock, Sarah finally called it quits for the day. Go home, see your kid, we start the heavy lifting tomorrow morning. Dylan packed up his things and left, taking the elevator down to the lobby in a kind of daze. Everything was moving faster than he'd initially planned for. He was in now, truly inside the machine, with access to the inner workings of Project Sentinel that he'd been trying to reach for months. But he was also significantly more exposed, more visible to people who might start asking uncomfortable questions. The anonymous, low-level assistant who could fade into the background was gone. Now he was someone Vanessa Drake had personally approved for a sensitive position, someone people would remember and notice if things went wrong. The evening commute gave him time to think while the subway rattled through dark tunnels. He needed to move carefully now, needed a comprehensive strategy for what came next that accounted for his changed position. He had evidence of past crimes, the documents from Finch's office, the emails discussing cover-ups, the participant files showing deaths marked as unrelated complications. But what he really needed was a way to stop the future crimes before they happened. Phase 4 couldn't be allowed to start. Those 40 people who were about to sign up thinking they were contributing to legitimate scientific progress couldn't end up like Lily, like the others whose names were listed in files marked deceased. Dylan picked Emma up from Mrs. Calloway's apartment, where she'd been doing homework at the kitchen table and eating fresh-baked oatmeal cookies. Daddy, Mrs. Calloway taught me how to measure ingredients. Can we bake something this weekend? Absolutely, Bug. Whatever you want. Back at their apartment, Dylan made simple pasta for dinner while Emma chattered about her day, about the science project her class was starting on plant growth, about how her friend Sophie had lost another tooth, about the book they were reading during story time. He listened with genuine attention, letting her voice anchor him to what mattered, to why he was taking these risks. After Emma was asleep, Dylan sat in the dark living room with his laptop open and forced himself to think strategically rather than emotionally. He couldn't just charge ahead on anger and grief. He needed a plan that would actually work, that would stop Phase 4 and expose what Vanessa had done without getting himself killed or disappeared in the process. His phone buzzed. Unknown number. Dylan stared at it for a moment before answering. "Hello? Mr. Cross, this is Helen Ortiz. Do you have a moment?" Dylan's stomach clenched. "Of course. Ms. Drake would like to meet with you tomorrow morning at 7 before you start your regular workday." The bottom dropped out of Dylan's world. "May I ask what this is regarding?" She didn't specify the agenda, just asked that I schedule private time with you. Helen's voice was professionally neutral, offering no hints. "Does 7 o'clock work with your schedule?" "Yes, I'll be there." "Excellent. I'll send you the necessary access credentials for the executive floor." She hung up without saying goodbye. Dylan sat on the couch, phone still in his hand, trying to control the panic rising in his chest like cold water. Vanessa wanted to see him, alone, early, before anyone else would be around to witness whatever happened. Either she was genuinely impressed with his work and wanted to discuss his new role in more detail, or she'd figured out exactly who he was, and tomorrow morning at 7 he'd disappear the same way everyone else who got too close to the truth disappeared. Dylan forced himself to breathe slowly, to think. If Vanessa suspected something, she wouldn't have approved his transfer. She would have just quietly had him removed. The meeting was probably legitimate, just her being thorough about someone joining a sensitive division. Probably. Dylan got up and went to check on Emma, watched her sleeping peacefully with her stuffed rabbit clutched under one arm. Then he went back to his laptop and spent the next 2 hours making preparations he hoped were excessive paranoia. He backed up all the photographs he'd taken to 3 different encrypted cloud locations with access credentials written in a letter he sealed and hid in his apartment. He compiled everything he knew into a detailed document and saved copies to secure drives, including one he'd mail to himself at a P.O. box tomorrow. He set up a dead man switch, an automated email that would send evidence to a list of journalists and regulatory agencies if he didn't log in to reset it every 72 hours. It felt paranoid. It felt like the behavior of someone who'd watched too many conspiracy thrillers. But Lily had died because she'd gotten too close to this truth, and Dylan wasn't going to make the mistake of assuming he was somehow immune to the same fate. He barely slept. When his alarm went off at 5:30, he'd been staring at the ceiling for over an hour, running through scenarios and planning responses to questions he couldn't predict. Dylan showered, shaved carefully, and dressed in his best suit, the one he'd bought for Lily's funeral and had worn to exactly 3 events since. He left the apartment early enough to stop for coffee and walk the long route to Drake Technologies, trying to settle his nerves, trying to get his mind into the calm, clear state he'd need. The building was nearly empty at 6:40 when Dylan badged through security. He took the elevator to the executive floor using the temporary credentials Helen had sent to his phone. The doors opened onto a reception area that looked like it belonged in an art gallery. Modern sculptures, floor-to-ceiling windows framing the city skyline, furniture that probably cost more than most cars. Helen sat at her desk looking perfectly put together despite the early hour, as if she'd been there for hours already. "Mr. Cross?" "Right on time. Miss Drake is expecting you." She gestured toward a door at the far end of the reception area. "Go ahead in." Dylan walked down the hallway on carpet so thick his footsteps made no sound. Each step felt heavier than the last. He knocked once on the door. "Come in." Vanessa's office was both exactly what Dylan expected and somehow more understated. Massive, obviously, with panoramic windows that made the entire city look like it existed for her view. But the furniture was expensive without being ostentatious. The art was abstract and probably priceless, but not showy. Everything spoke of power so secure it didn't need to announce itself. Vanessa sat behind her desk, already fully dressed for the workday, even though sunrise was barely starting to color the sky outside. She looked up when Dylan entered. "Mr. Cross, have a seat." Dylan sat in one of the chairs facing her desk, keeping his posture relaxed despite every instinct screaming at him to stay alert. Vanessa studied him in silence for what felt like an eternity. "I had my team look into your background more thoroughly after yesterday's board presentation." "Here it comes," Dylan thought, bracing himself. She knows who I am. She knows what I'm doing here. You have quite an impressive resume for someone who's been processing expense reports for 2 years, Vanessa continued. MIT, top of your class in applied mathematics. Strategic consulting at Mercer and Company, where you were apparently being groomed for partner track, glowing recommendations from every supervisor you've ever had. She leaned back in her chair. So I'll ask you directly, Mr. Cross, why are you really here? Dylan had prepared for this, had his story ready. I needed stable work after my wife died suddenly. I had a 6-month-old daughter, and that's the story you gave Dr. Finch. I read his notes. Vanessa's voice wasn't harsh, just direct. I'm asking you directly, and I'd appreciate an honest answer. You could have found strategic consulting work at a dozen firms in this city with significantly better compensation and more intellectually engaging projects. Instead, you took a job processing expense reports at a company where you're overqualified by a factor of 10. Why? Dylan made a split-second decision. Partial truth, the kind that would ring authentic because it was mostly real. Because I was completely falling apart, he said quietly. My wife died suddenly when our daughter was 6 months old. I had a newborn I barely knew how to take care of, and I couldn't think straight for months. The consulting work required me to be sharp constantly, to travel extensively, to put in 80-hour weeks where mistakes could cost clients millions. I couldn't do it. I was barely functional, so I took the first stable job I could find that would let me leave at 5 o'clock and actually be present for my daughter instead of just surviving. He paused. It wasn't strategic. It was survival. Vanessa's expression softened almost imperceptibly. And now? Now Emma's 6. She's in school full days. We have routines that work, systems that function. I'm not just surviving anymore. I'm ready to actually use my brain again instead of just going through motions. Vanessa nodded slowly, seeming to accept this explanation. That aligns with what the background check found. No concerning patterns, no red flags. Just a man who needed to step back for a while and is now ready to step forward again. The relief Dylan felt was almost physical, like pressure releasing from his chest. I'm telling you all this because I don't bring people into my inner circle casually, Vanessa said, her tone shifting to something more serious. Advanced research is the most strategically important division in this entire company. What we're developing there will define Drake Technologies' market position for the next decade minimum. The people working on Project Sentinel need to be not just technically competent, but absolutely trustworthy in ways that go beyond standard corporate loyalty. I understand, ma'am. Do you really? Because Dr. Finch sees you as a valuable asset, someone who can help him navigate the business complexities while he focuses on the science. But I need to know that you truly understand what's at stake with this work. Her eyes locked onto his with uncomfortable intensity. The research we're doing is genuinely revolutionary. It's also controversial because people who don't understand the science will try to interfere, to impose restrictions and regulations that would cripple real innovation. Progress requires taking risks that make cautious people uncomfortable. Dylan met her gaze directly, knowing his next words mattered enormously. I understand that meaningful progress requires taking risks other people aren't willing to take, Ms. Drake. And I can handle working in environments where the stakes are high and the scrutiny is intense. Something in Vanessa's expression shifted toward approval. Good. Then we understand each other clearly. She stood, signaling the meeting was ending. Welcome to Advanced Research officially, Mr. Cross. I'm taking a personal interest in this division's success. Don't make me regret this decision. I won't, ma'am. Dylan left her office, feeling like he'd just passed an exam he hadn't known he was taking. Vanessa hadn't uncovered his real identity, hadn't connected him to Lily, or realized why he was actually there. He was safe. For now. The next 2 weeks blurred together in an exhausting haze of intense work and careful observation. Dylan settled into his new role on Finch's team, proving himself consistently valuable while quietly gathering information like a researcher cataloging specimens. He learned the names of everyone even peripherally involved in Project Sentinel, mapped out who reported to whom and who actually held influence versus who just had impressive titles. He identified weak points in their operation where the right pressure applied at the right moment could cause significant disruption. He learned that James, one of the junior analysts, had expressed private ethical concerns to Sarah about the pace they were moving at with human trials, worries that they weren't allowing enough time for proper safety analysis, that Sarah herself had pushed back multiple times on Finch's aggressive timelines and been overruled by direct orders from Vanessa, that there were fractures in the team, people who'd gone along because they needed their careers to survive, but weren't entirely comfortable with what they were doing. Those fractures represented opportunities if Dylan could figure out how to exploit them. He also maintained his cover with obsessive care. He was the dedicated analyst who occasionally had to leave early for parent-teacher conferences, but always made up the hours later. He joined the team for after-work drinks one Friday, learned about their lives outside the office, their families and hobbies and motivations, made himself likable, trustworthy, someone they'd defend if questions were ever raised, all while methodically planning how to destroy everything they were building. 3 weeks after this board presentation, Dylan was working late when Sarah appeared at his desk looking uncomfortable. "Got a minute to talk privately?" "Of course." Dylan followed her into an empty conference room. Sarah closed the door and leaned against the table. "I wanted to give you a heads up about something before you hear it through other channels. We're starting participant recruitment for Phase 4 next week. You'll probably start seeing communications about it, logistics discussions. I wanted to make sure you understood the sensitivity level." "Understood. Keep everything confidential, need-to-know basis only." "Exactly." She paused, clearly wrestling with something. "Listen, some people have raised questions about what happened during Phase 3. There were complications, like I mentioned before when you first joined the team. A few participants had adverse reactions to the treatment protocol. Most of them recovered fully with medical intervention, but there were some serious incidents we had to manage." Dylan kept his voice carefully neutral, curious but not pushy. "How serious are we talking about?" Sarah looked at him for a long moment, clearly deciding how much to reveal. 3 participant deaths over the 18-month trial period. All of them were thoroughly investigated by our medical review board and ruled as unrelated to the treatment protocol itself, underlying health conditions we hadn't detected in screening, that kind of thing. But the families received substantial financial compensation regardless, and everyone signed comprehensive confidentiality agreements as part of their participation terms. That must have been incredibly difficult to deal with. "It was terrible," Sarah said, and she genuinely seemed to mean it. "Nobody wants to see people hurt, especially not in research meant to help people eventually. But this is experimental medicine working at the absolute cutting edge. Sometimes adverse outcomes happen despite our best efforts and most rigorous protocols. What matters is that we learn from every incident, adjust our approach, and keep moving forward toward breakthroughs that will help thousands of people in the future." The rationalization was delivered with complete sincerity. Sarah had genuinely convinced herself that the deaths were acceptable collateral damage for scientific progress, had found a way to sleep at night by focusing on future benefits rather than present costs. "I appreciate you telling me this," Dylan said. "It helps me understand the full context of what we're doing." After Sarah left, Dylan sat alone in the quiet conference room and felt the rage building in his chest like pressure behind a dam. 3 deaths she knew about and was willing to admit to. How many more had there been that she didn't know about, that had been buried under different classifications? Lily had been one of them. Her death marked down as a tragic car accident when she'd actually been a threat they'd systematically eliminated. Dylan pulled out his phone and opened the encrypted app where he'd been meticulously building his case file. He added Sarah's admission to the growing collection of evidence. He had enough now to prove a clear pattern. People had died, Drake Technologies knew about it, and they'd chosen to continue with even more aggressive research rather than pause and investigate properly. The question that kept him awake at night was what to actually do with all this evidence. Going public through traditional media would expose the crimes, but Vanessa would survive it. She had lawyers who could tie up investigations for years, enough money to make regulatory problems quietly disappear. She'd weathered scandals before and somehow always emerged stronger, more untouchable. No. Dylan needed something more surgical and devastating, something that would destroy her from the inside out, that would turn her own empire against her when they realized she'd been lying to them about the risks. He needed to identify the board members who were already nervous about Phase 4, who'd voted yes because they trusted Vanessa's assurances but might change their minds rapidly if presented with evidence she'd been deliberately deceiving them. He needed to figure out which senior executives would turn on her instantly if they thought cooperation could save their own careers from the fallout. Most importantly, he needed to make himself valuable enough, trusted enough, that when he finally made his move, people would actually listen instead of dismissing him as a disgruntled employee with an agenda. Over the following week, Dylan carefully expanded his network throughout the company. He started having lunch with people from different divisions, asking questions that seemed like casual curiosity, but were actually intelligence gathering. Learning about internal politics, about who held real power versus who just occupied impressive offices, about the fault lines and tensions that existed beneath the corporate surface. He befriended an executive assistant named Rachel, who worked directly for Patricia Voss, the board member who'd seemed uncomfortable during the car conversation Dylan had overheard. He helped Rachel with a complex budget analysis she'd been struggling with, then casually mentioned he'd noticed some concerning patterns in advanced research spending that didn't quite align with what the division was supposedly doing. "What kind of patterns?" Rachel asked, her curiosity immediately engaged. "Probably nothing significant. Just some facility operating expenses that seem unusually high for the stated research activities. I'm sure there's a reasonable explanation I'm just not seeing." He planted the seed carefully and moved on to other topics, letting her natural curiosity and diligence do the work of raising questions with Patricia. He also started documenting absolutely everything with obsessive thoroughness. Every meeting he attended, every significant conversation, every decision, and who made it. Building a comprehensive timeline that showed exactly how Phase 4 had progressed, who knew what, and precisely when they knew it, who'd raised concerns, and how those concerns had been dismissed or ignored. 1 month after officially joining Advanced Research, Dylan was sitting in a routine status meeting when Finch made an announcement that sent ice through his veins. "Excellent news! We've successfully enrolled our first 10 participants for Phase 4. Initial medical screening begins next week at the Bahamas facility." Finch looked genuinely pleased. "If everything proceeds smoothly with the screening protocols, we'll begin the actual treatment protocol in approximately 3 weeks. Everyone around the conference table nodded approvingly, looking satisfied with the progress. Dylan nodded too, keeping his expression professionally neutral. But inside, a countdown clock had just started ticking. He had 3 weeks maximum before Phase 4 actually began. 3 weeks to find a way to stop it before more people ended up like Lily, before more families received compensation checks and NDAs instead of their loved ones coming home. That night, after Emma was safely asleep, Dylan sat at his kitchen table and pulled up all the evidence he'd painstakingly gathered over the past months. Photographs of incriminating documents from Finch's office. Recorded conversations where people casually admitted things they probably shouldn't have. Financial records showing money flowing to NDA, enforcement and family compensation packages. Sarah's admission about the 3 deaths in Phase 3. It was substantial, more than he dared hope to collect when he started. But was it actually enough to stop what was coming? Dylan made a decision that felt simultaneously reckless and necessary. He opened his laptop and composed an email, not to journalists or regulatory agencies or law enforcement. Those channels would take too long, get buried in bureaucracy and legal maneuvering. Instead, he was going directly to the people who had immediate power to stop Phase 4 if they chose to exercise it. He addressed the email to 3 specific board members he'd identified as most likely to be genuinely concerned about legal liability and reputational risk. Patricia Voss, who'd seemed distinctly uncomfortable during that overheard car conversation about moving trials offshore. Marcus Chen, who had a well-known reputation for being extremely risk-averse in his investment decisions. David Sterling, who'd invested significant personal wealth and would lose everything if Drake Technologies went down in a major scandal. The email was carefully worded, anonymous, sent through multiple layers of encryption he'd set up specifically for this purpose. Just enough specific information to raise serious red flags without revealing his identity or how he'd obtained the documentation. Subject: Urgent. Phase 4. Safety concerns. Advanced Research Division. Attached, you will find documentation showing that Drake Technologies' Advanced Research Division has been conducting human trials with inadequate safety protocols and insufficient oversight. 3 participants died during Phase 3 trials, and substantial evidence suggests their deaths were deliberately misclassified to avoid triggering regulatory investigations that would have shut down the research program. Phase 4 is currently scheduled to begin active treatment protocols in 3 weeks, using methodologies substantially similar to those that resulted in Phase 3 fatalities. I am providing this information because you have both fiduciary duties to the company and personal liability exposure as board members. If these trials proceed as currently planned and additional adverse outcomes occur, the resulting legal and financial liability could potentially destroy Drake Technologies entirely. I strongly recommend you demand an immediate independent investigation of the Advanced Research Division before allowing Phase 4 to proceed. Dylan attached carefully selected documents, enough to prove the basic facts and establish the pattern, but not so much that it would reveal exactly where the leak had originated from. He stared at the email for a long time, cursor hovering over the send button. This was the moment of no return. Once he sent this, everything would change. The board would investigate, Vanessa would shift into aggressive damage control mode, and eventually someone would figure out the leak had come from inside Advanced Research. They'd narrow down who had access to these specific documents. They'd figure out it was him. But 10 people had already enrolled in Phase 4, had already signed consent forms thinking they were contributing to legitimate scientific research. They deserved to know that participants had died in previous trials, and Drake Technologies had covered it up. They deserved a chance to make an actually informed decision. Dylan thought about Emma sleeping peacefully in the next room, about the stable life he'd fought so hard to build for her after Lily died. Then he thought about Lily herself, about seeing her name in that file marked terminated instead of died, about all the other names in that file who'd never gotten justice. He hit send. The email disappeared into the encrypted network, theoretically untraceable back to him. Dylan closed his laptop and sat in the darkness of his kitchen, waiting for the explosion he'd just deliberately triggered. It came significantly faster than he'd expected. The next morning, Dylan arrived at work to find Helen Ortiz waiting by the elevator bank on the 9th floor, clearly watching for him. "Mr. Cross, Ms. Drake needs to see you in her office immediately." His stomach dropped through the floor. "Of course. Is there a problem?" She didn't specify the nature of the meeting. Helen's expression was professionally blank, revealing absolutely nothing. "Please follow me." Dylan followed her down the hallway, pulse pounding in his ears. They'd traced it already. Somehow they'd figured out the email came from him, and this was it. He'd miscalculated badly. Vanessa was on her phone when Dylan entered, her voice sharp enough to cut steel. "I don't care what their supposed concerns are, Patricia. We've been over the safety protocols exhaustively. This is clearly someone trying to sabotage us." She listened for a moment, jaw tight. "Fine. Schedule the emergency meeting. But I'm telling you right now, this is a complete waste of everyone's time." She ended the call and looked at Dylan with an expression he couldn't quite read. "Sit down." He sat. 3 board members received an anonymous email last night making serious allegations about Phase 4 safety and demanding an immediate investigation. Her eyes were hard, calculating. Someone with access to confidential internal documents leaked highly sensitive information to board members. Someone currently on Dr. Finch's team. Dylan forced himself to keep breathing normally, to look appropriately confused rather than terrified. What kind of information was leaked? Medical records from Phase 3. Internal financial data. Communications about adverse events. Things that only a very small handful of people have any access to. She leaned forward slightly. "I need to know if you've observed anyone on the team acting strangely over the past few weeks. Anyone asking questions outside their normal scope, accessing files they shouldn't have reason to look at, anything that seemed off." This was a test. Dylan knew it with absolute certainty. "I haven't noticed anything unusual," he said carefully, thinking through each word, "but I've only been on the team for about a month. I'm still learning everyone's normal patterns and responsibilities." Vanessa studied him in silence that stretched uncomfortably long. "You're observant, Mr. Cross. You notice details other people miss. I've seen it in your work. If you see anything, hear anything, notice anyone behaving suspiciously, I need you to tell me immediately and directly. We have a serious leak somewhere in Advanced Research, and I will find it." "Of course. I'll keep my eyes open." "Do that." She dismissed him with a slight gesture. Dylan left her office feeling like he'd just barely dodged a bullet that had passed close enough to feel the wind. But he knew the reprieve was only temporary. The investigation had officially begun, and somewhere in this building, Vanessa Drake was actively hunting for him. Dylan walked back to the conference room on legs that felt unsteady, his mind racing through calculations and probabilities he didn't want to face. Vanessa was hunting for the leak, which meant he had days at most before the investigation tightened around him like a noose. The careful invisibility he'd maintained for months was gone. Now he was exposed, visible, and running out of time to finish what he'd started. Sarah looked up when he entered, her face tight with worry. "Everything okay? Helen came and grabbed you pretty urgently." Vanessa wanted to know if I'd noticed anything unusual on the team. Apparently someone leaked confidential information to the board. Sarah's face went pale, all the color draining out in an instant. "What kind of information?" She didn't give me specifics, just asked if I'd observed anyone acting suspicious or accessing files outside their normal scope. Dylan sat down at his laptop, keeping his voice carefully casual. I told her I haven't noticed anything out of the ordinary. "This is really bad." Sarah stood up abruptly and started pacing, her professional composure cracking. If someone's actively leaking confidential research data to board members, the whole project could get shut down immediately. We're literally weeks away from starting Phase 4 treatments. Everything we've worked for could just disappear. "I'm sure they'll figure out who did it," Dylan said, then added with calculated casualness, "Though I guess it depends on what was actually leaked. Was it genuinely damaging or just someone being paranoid about normal research protocols?" Sarah stopped pacing and looked at him. "I need to talk to Garrett right now." After she left, Dylan pulled out his phone and checked the encrypted email account he'd set up specifically for this purpose. 3 responses had come in overnight, and his heart rate picked up as he read them. Patricia Voss had written, "This is deeply concerning and requires immediate attention. I'm calling for an emergency board meeting tomorrow morning at 8. We need independent verification of these claims before proceeding with any Phase 4 activities." Marcus Chen's response was shorter and more direct. "If this information is accurate, we have massive legal liability exposure and potential criminal charges. Demanding immediate external audit of entire Advanced Research Division." David Sterling had written the longest reply, and his anger was palpable even through text. "I've invested $50 million personally in this division based on assurances I was given. If you're lying to me, I will find you and destroy you. If you're telling the truth, someone at this company is going to prison. Either way, I want answers and I want them immediately." Dylan felt a grim satisfaction settle in his chest. The board was fracturing exactly like he'd hoped. The careful unity Vanessa had maintained was cracking under pressure. But satisfaction was tempered by the realization that he was running out of time faster than he'd anticipated. The next 24 hours moved like a fever dream, where everything felt simultaneously too fast and agonizingly slow. Dylan went through the motions of his regular work while the executive floor above him erupted into barely contained chaos. Emergency meetings were called and then abruptly canceled. Finch spent hours behind closed doors with Vanessa, emerging looking progressively more haggard. Sarah snapped at people over minor issues that normally wouldn't have bothered her, the stress bleeding through her professional facade. That evening, Dylan got a text from Rachel, Patricia Voss's executive assistant. "Emergency board meeting scheduled tomorrow, 8 a.m. sharp. Patricia asked me to pull all advanced research files from past 3 years, including personnel records and financial statements. Whatever this is about, it's big. Thought you'd want to know." Dylan sat in his apartment after putting Emma to bed, staring at that message, and realized he'd set something in motion he could no longer control or predict. The board would investigate thoroughly, would demand answers and documentation. Vanessa would fight back with everything she had, would try desperately to contain the damage and control the narrative. And somewhere in that chaos, the truth about what had really happened to Lily might actually come out into the light. Or Dylan might end up dead in an accident before anyone had a chance to listen to what he knew. Dylan pulled up the dead man's switch system on his laptop, the automated email program that would send all his evidence to a carefully curated list of journalists and regulatory agencies if he didn't manually reset it every 72 hours. He stared at the timer, then adjusted it to 24 hours. If something happened to him tomorrow during or after that board meeting, the world would know everything he'd discovered. Then he pulled out a notebook and started writing a letter to Emma in his careful handwriting. He wrote about how much he loved her, about how proud he was of the person she was becoming, about how everything he'd done had been to make the world safer for her and kids like her. He sealed it in an envelope and walked it down the hall to Mrs. Calloway's apartment, asking her to hold it somewhere safe and only give it to Emma if he didn't come back for her within 2 days. "Dylan, you're scaring me," Mrs. Calloway said, taking the envelope with trembling hands. "What's going on? Are you in some kind of danger?" "It's just insurance. Probably nothing will happen, and I'll come get that letter back in a few days and we'll laugh about how paranoid I was being." He tried to smile reassuringly and knew he was failing. "But if something does happen, Emma needs to know I love her, and everything I did was to try to make things right." "Should I call someone? The police? A lawyer?" "No, please don't. Just trust me and keep Emma safe if anything goes wrong. That's all I'm asking." The board meeting was scheduled to start at 8 in the morning. Dylan wasn't invited. He was too junior, too new to the division to be included in executive-level discussions. But he positioned himself strategically in the 9th floor conference room where his team normally worked, in a spot where he could see people coming and going from the main boardroom down the hallway through the glass walls. He watched Vanessa arrive first at 7:40, her face a carefully controlled mask that radiated cold fury barely held in check. Then the board members started filing in, looking uniformly serious, Patricia with a banker's box full of files, Marcus with his lawyer, David Sterling with an expression that could have cut steel. Finch appeared 20 minutes later carrying his laptop and an armload of folders, his normally confident posture replaced by something that looked closer to dread. The meeting lasted 4 hours. Dylan tried to work on other projects, tried to look busy and productive while his stomach churned with anxiety and his mind spun through dozens of possible outcomes. Sarah came by once around 10:30, looking absolutely devastated. "They're talking about suspending the entire advanced research division pending a comprehensive investigation. Years of work, everything we've built, all of it could just be gone." Her voice cracked slightly. "Everything we've sacrificed for could disappear." "What exactly are they investigating?" Dylan asked, keeping his tone carefully neutral. "I don't know. They won't tell us anything specific, just that serious concerns have been raised about our protocols and oversight." She looked at Dylan with sudden, sharp suspicion. "You really didn't notice anything unusual? No one accessing files they shouldn't have? No one asking strange questions? Nothing that seemed off to you?" Dylan met her eyes directly, his expression open and honest. "I told Vanessa the complete truth. I haven't seen anything that raised red flags for me." After Sarah left looking only marginally reassured, Dylan's phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. "Conference room A, immediately. VD Vanessa Drake." Dylan stood up slowly, feeling like he was walking toward the edge of a cliff he couldn't see the bottom of. This was the moment. Whatever happened next would determine everything. The boardroom was mostly empty when Dylan arrived, the massive table cleared of papers and laptops. Just Vanessa standing alone by the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, her silhouette sharp against the morning light. She turned when he entered. "Close the door behind you." He did, hearing the click of the latch with unnatural clarity. The board just voted to suspend Phase 4 indefinitely, pending an independent investigation into our Phase 3 protocols, outcomes, and oversight procedures. Her voice was cold and controlled, each word precisely measured. Someone provided them with highly confidential medical records, internal financial data, private communications between executives. Someone who had access to files that were supposed to be secure and protected. Dylan said nothing, his heart pounding, but his face calm. "Dr. Finch vouches for his entire team absolutely, says they're all trustworthy professionals, that the leak must have come from somewhere else in the organization, maybe someone in legal or compliance." She walked toward him slowly, each step deliberate. "But I don't believe in coincidences, Mr. Cross. You joined this team exactly 5 weeks ago. 3 weeks later, confidential information appears in an anonymous email to 3 specific board members. You're the newest person with high-level access to those files." "I didn't send any email to anyone," Dylan said, keeping his voice steady and meeting her gaze. "Then explain to me how someone obtained access to documents from Dr. Finch's personal office. Medical review files that were kept in a locked drawer that only 3 people have keys to." "I don't know. Maybe someone else had access before I even joined the team. Maybe the leak has been happening longer than you think." Vanessa studied him for a long moment that stretched uncomfortably. "Who are you really, Mr. Cross?" "I'm exactly who I told you I am." "No. There's something else here, something you're not saying." She pulled out her phone with a smooth motion and held it up so he could see the screen. The photo displayed was one Dylan recognized immediately. Lily, younger, smiling radiantly at the camera during a journalism awards ceremony where she'd won for investigative reporting. Your wife, Lillian Cross, investigative journalist specializing in corporate accountability and medical research ethics. She died 3 years ago in what was ruled a tragic car accident. Dylan's blood turned to ice water in his veins. Except it wasn't really an accident, was it? Vanessa's voice had gone soft now, almost gentle in a way that was somehow more terrifying than anger would have been. She was investigating Drake Technologies specifically, digging into our research protocols, tracking down and interviewing former trial participants, asking very pointed questions about participant deaths that weren't supposed to be publicly connected to our programs. And then quite suddenly, her brakes failed on a steep hill. Dylan couldn't breathe, couldn't make his lungs work properly, couldn't move. I didn't order it, Vanessa said, and there was something in her voice that sounded almost like regret. I need you to understand that clearly. When I found out what had actually happened, I was furious beyond words. The people directly responsible were terminated from this company immediately and permanently. But the damage was already done, and I couldn't undo it. You're lying. Dylan's voice came out rough, barely recognizable. I'm not lying to you. Your wife got dangerously close to information that could have destroyed this entire company, information about research protocols we were using that weren't technically approved yet. Someone on my corporate security team made an executive decision without my knowledge or authorization. By the time I actually knew what had happened, Lily was already gone and there was nothing I could do to change that. Vanessa set her phone down carefully on the conference table. I'm telling you this now because I need you to understand something important. I'm not a monster, Mr. Cross. I'm not some villain from a movie. I'm trying to do something genuinely important here, something that will eventually save thousands of lives. Yes, there have been casualties along the way. Yes, we've taken risks that made cautious people uncomfortable. But the end goal, the breakthrough we're working toward, is worth those costs. You killed my wife. Dylan's voice was flat, emotionless, the words coming from somewhere very far away. I didn't kill her, but I took full responsibility for what happened anyway. I made sure you were compensated, made sure you had stable employment here at this company, made sure Emma had everything she would need for her future. Dylan's mind was spinning, trying to process what he was hearing. What are you talking about? The settlement that came through 6 months after the accident. The college fund that was established for Emma with enough money to pay for any university she wants to attend. The job application you submitted here that was mysteriously approved despite you being dramatically overqualified for the position. You think those were all just fortunate coincidences? Vanessa shook her head slowly. I couldn't bring Lily back to life. Nothing could do that. But I could make absolutely certain that her family was taken care of, that you and Emma would never have to worry about money or security. You're completely insane if you think that makes any of this okay. I'm pragmatic. And right now, I'm giving you a choice that very few people in your position would ever get. Vanessa's voice hardened into steel. You leaked those files because you wanted revenge for what happened to Lily. I understand that motivation completely, but Phase 4 will genuinely save lives, Mr. Cross. Real people with real neurological conditions who will benefit tremendously from this technology we're developing. If you succeed in destroying this project entirely, all those people suffer unnecessarily. People died in Phase 3. Multiple people. 3 people out of 40 total participants. That's a 7.5% mortality rate, which is actually significantly better than many other experimental trials at similar stages. She stepped closer. The other 37 participants are living completely normal lives right now. Some of them have dramatically improved neurological function compared to before the trial. Your wife would have understood these trade-offs. She was a journalist who believed passionately in truth, but she also believed in scientific progress and helping people. Don't you dare presume to tell me what Lily would have believed. Then here's the actual truth without any softening. The board is going to investigate thoroughly over the next several months. They're going to find evidence of exactly what you sent them. Deaths that occurred during Phase 3, compensation packages paid out to families, NDAs signed to protect confidentiality. But what they'll also discover is that we followed all proper medical protocols, that every single death was extensively reviewed by independent medical boards, that we compensated families far beyond any legal requirements. Vanessa's eyes were hard now, all pretense of sympathy gone. This company will survive the investigation. Phase 4 will eventually be approved once we satisfy whatever additional oversight requirements they impose. And you'll have accomplished absolutely nothing except delaying research that could genuinely help people who are suffering. Or I could go completely public with everything. Tell the media exactly what really happened to Lily and why. You could certainly try, but you have no concrete proof that I was personally involved in her death. The people who were directly responsible have been gone from this company for years. And you're an employee who just illegally leaked confidential medical data in violation of approximately 15 different federal laws. Who exactly do you think the authorities will believe? A grieving widower with an obvious agenda, or a CEO with documented evidence of proper protocols? Dylan realized with sinking certainty that she was absolutely right. He'd been so singularly focused on gathering evidence about Phase 3 that he hadn't thought carefully enough about what would actually happen after he exposed it. Vanessa was too intelligent, too well protected by lawyers and money, and carefully constructed plausible deniability. But I'm offering you another option right now, Vanessa said, her tone shifting slightly. Walk away from all of this. Take Emma somewhere safe, somewhere far from here. I'll arrange a severance package that will set both of you up comfortably for the rest of your lives. You'll never have to work another day if you don't want to. And in return, you stop trying to destroy what we're building here. You're trying to buy me off. Exactly like you bought off all those families who lost people in Phase 3. I'm trying to give you an opportunity to actually be present for your daughter instead of ending up in federal prison or worse. Vanessa's voice softened slightly. I know you see me as the villain in your personal story, but I'm offering you something Lily never got, an actual choice about what comes next for you and your family. Dylan stood there, his mind racing frantically through options and scenarios. Everything she'd said was probably accurate. He couldn't definitively prove she'd personally ordered Lily's death. The evidence he'd gathered would expose the Phase 3 deaths, but wouldn't necessarily stop Phase 4 permanently. And he'd broken multiple serious laws obtaining and sharing that confidential information, which made him vulnerable to prosecution. He thought about Emma, about the quiet life they'd managed to build together, about what Lily would actually want for their daughter's future. I need time to think about this, he said finally. You have exactly 24 hours before the board investigation narrows its focus to identifying the leak source. After that point, they'll figure out it was you. Much better to simply disappear cleanly before that happens. Dylan left the boardroom feeling like the ground had fundamentally shifted beneath his feet. Everything he thought he'd been carefully building toward had just collapsed into something far more complicated and morally ambiguous than he'd imagined. He went back to his desk, packed his personal belongings mechanically, and left the building in a daze. That evening, Dylan sat with Emma after dinner, watching her draw elaborate pictures of flowers and butterflies with colored pencils, and tried desperately to figure out what the right answer actually was. Daddy, why do you look so sad? Emma asked without looking up from her drawing. Just thinking about your mom, Bug. Do you miss her a lot? Every single day of my life. Emma set down her pencil and climbed into his lap, wrapping her small arms around his neck with fierce certainty. It's okay to be sad sometimes about missing people. Mrs. Calloway told me that when I was sad about not having a mommy like other kids. Dylan held his daughter close and realized with painful clarity that Vanessa had been right about one thing. Lily would have wanted him to choose Emma's future over revenge for her past. But there had to be another way forward, something that didn't require him to just walk away quietly and let Vanessa win completely. Dylan spent most of that night going methodically through every single piece of evidence he'd painstakingly collected, looking for something he'd missed, some angle he hadn't fully explored. And buried deep in the financial records at 2 a.m, he finally found it. The compensation payments to Phase 3 families had all come from one specific account, but there were other payments flowing from that exact same account, regular monthly transfers to offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands. And those payments coincided almost perfectly with board meeting dates. The amounts varied, but the pattern was unmistakable. They looked exactly like systematic bribes. If Dylan could prove conclusively that Vanessa had been bribing board members to approve Phase 4, despite knowing the actual risks, that changed the entire equation. That was a crime she couldn't distance herself from with plausible deniability, couldn't blame on rogue security personnel. Dylan pulled up his contact list and made a phone call he'd been deliberately avoiding. The phone rang 4 times before a gruff voice answered. David Sterling? Mr. Sterling, this is Dylan Cross from Drake Technologies. I'm the person who sent you that anonymous email about Phase 4 safety concerns. Silence stretched for several long seconds. Then, I'm listening very carefully. Vanessa Drake has been making systematic payments to at least 2 board members over the past year to secure their votes on Phase 4 approval. I can prove it with financial documentation, but I'm going to need your help to actually do anything meaningful with that proof. Why should I trust anything you're telling me? Because you personally invested $50 million in a research division run by someone who's been systematically lying to you about risks and bribing your fellow board members. And if Phase 4 moves forward and more participants die, you'll be held personally liable in the lawsuits that follow. Another long pause filled with calculation. What exactly do you need from me? 24 hours later, Dylan sat in David Sterling's impressive downtown office with Patricia Voss and Marcus Chen, the 3 board members who'd received his original email, the 3 who hadn't been receiving mysterious offshore payments. He laid out everything he'd discovered over months of careful investigation, the Phase 3 deaths that had been deliberately misclassified, the systematic cover-ups, Lily's murder disguised as a mechanical accident, and most importantly, the detailed financial evidence of board member manipulation. Patricia looked physically sick. If even half of this is actually true, it's completely true, Dylan interrupted. Every word of it, and there's more you need to know. The Phase 4 participants who've already enrolled and gone through initial screening, they weren't told anything about the Phase 3 mortality rate in their consent process. Those consent forms are fraudulent, which means this company is facing massive criminal liability. Marcus Chen was already pulling out his phone with shaking hands. I'm calling the Securities and Exchange Commission right now, and the FBI. Wait just a moment, Patricia held up her hand. If we immediately go to federal authorities with this, it becomes an uncontrolled media circus overnight. The company's stock will crash completely. Drake Technologies could collapse entirely within days. That's thousands of innocent employees who lose their jobs and livelihoods. And if we don't report it, more people will almost certainly die, Dylan said quietly but firmly. David Sterling leaned back in his expensive leather chair, fingers steepled thoughtfully. There's a third option we should consider. We force Vanessa out immediately through an emergency board vote, shut down the entire advanced research division permanently, restructure the company completely under new leadership committed to ethical practices. Then we cooperate fully with investigators, but maintain some control over the narrative and timeline. Vanessa will fight that with everything she has, Patricia said. Let her fight all she wants. We have the votes now, and more importantly, we have documentation she can't refute. David looked directly at Dylan. You understand you'll need to testify about all of this, publicly, extensively. They'll come after you legally for the confidentiality violations. I know exactly what I'm risking, but I need one thing in return that's non-negotiable. Name it. Lily's death gets investigated properly by actual law enforcement, not just filed away as an accident, not quietly settled. Someone needs to answer for what happened to her. David nodded slowly. I'll personally make sure that happens. The next week moved with frightening speed. An emergency board meeting was called, and the vote to remove Vanessa Drake as CEO passed 8-4. She fought it with absolutely everything she had, threatened massive lawsuits, tried desperately to rally support among executives and major shareholders, leaked carefully crafted stories to friendly journalists. But the evidence was simply overwhelming and irrefutable. Federal investigators descended on Drake Technologies like a storm. The Advanced Research Division was shut down completely and immediately. The Phase 4 participants who'd already enrolled were contacted directly and told the complete truth about Phase 3 outcomes. Almost all of them withdrew from the study within 48 hours. Vanessa Drake was arrested 2 weeks later on multiple charges, including securities fraud, obstruction of justice, and conspiracy. The murder investigation into Lily's death was formally reopened with significantly more resources. Dylan testified for hours across multiple days about everything he'd discovered and everything he'd done. His lawyers argued forcefully that he'd acted as a legitimate whistleblower in the public interest, that the value of exposing corporate crimes outweighed the confidentiality violations. It would take many months to fully resolve the legal complexities. But Phase 4 never started, and the people who'd enrolled in it went home safely to their families instead of becoming statistics. 3 months after everything exploded into public view, Dylan sat in a small corporate office with Emma beside him, meeting with a victim compensation advocate the new board had hired. "The board has approved a substantial settlement package," the woman explained carefully, "for Lily's death and for your cooperation with all the investigations. The amount is quite significant." Dylan looked at the number written on the official document. It was enough that Emma would never have to worry about college tuition, about anything material, really. "There's also a formal job offer I'm authorized to present. The new CEO wants to completely rebuild the Advanced Research Division with proper ethical oversight and safety protocols. They want you to head the newly created Ethics and Safety Review Board with full authority to shut down any research that doesn't meet standards." Dylan almost laughed at the absurdity. "They want me to work for Drake Technologies after absolutely everything that's happened? They want someone who fundamentally can't be bought or intimidated. Someone who will actually protect participants and blow the whistle when necessary." She slid another document across the desk. "The salary is very generous, and you'd be in a real position to make certain what happened to Lily never happens to anyone else here." Dylan took the offer documents home and thought seriously about it for a full week, weighing all the implications. In the end, somewhat to his own surprise, he accepted the position. Not because he'd somehow forgiven Drake Technologies for what they'd done, or because the money solved anything fundamental, but because he genuinely could do more good from inside the system than outside it, because real lasting change required someone who understood how power actually worked and wasn't afraid to challenge it directly. 6 months later, Dylan stood in the completely renovated Advanced Research Division, much smaller now, more carefully structured, operating under scrutiny that would never fully fade. He just shut down a proposed research study that had tried to cut corners on safety protocols. The frustrated researchers had complained loudly to anyone who would listen. Dylan didn't care even slightly about their complaints. Sarah stopped by his office that afternoon. She'd chosen to stay with the company, now working on genuinely legitimate research under the kind of oversight Dylan had helped design and implement. "You know, some people in this building still actively hate you for what you did," she said without preamble. "I'm well aware of that. But I've been doing a lot of thinking lately about Phase 3, about all the things I told myself to justify continuing the work, about how easy it becomes to rationalize almost anything when you want something badly enough and convince yourself the ends justify the means." She looked at him directly. "You were right about what we were doing. It wasn't worth the cost. I'm genuinely sorry it took me so long to see that clearly." After she left, Dylan looked at the framed photo on his desk. Emma and him at her 7th birthday party just last month. Both of them smiling genuinely and spontaneously. He'd learned something crucially important through all of this. Revenge didn't actually fix anything meaningful. It didn't bring Lily back, didn't erase the pain of losing her, didn't fill the hole her absence had left. What mattered was making sure her death meant something tangible, that the system that had killed her got fundamentally better instead of just getting away with it. Power itself didn't automatically corrupt people. It just revealed who they really were when they thought they could get away with anything, when consequences seemed distant and abstract. And the only real check on that kind of power was people willing to stand up and speak truth even when it cost them absolutely everything. Dylan had lost his comfortable anonymity, his quiet, invisible life, his comforting illusion of safety. He'd gained something much harder to measure or quantify, the knowledge that when it had mattered most, he'd done the right thing even when it was terrifying, that when he'd been forced to choose, he'd chosen protecting vulnerable people over protecting himself. Emma would grow up knowing her mother had died fighting for truth and accountability, and her father had found a way to finish that fight. That legacy was worth more than any amount of money or any illusion of safety. That evening, Dylan left work exactly at 5 o'clock and picked Emma up from school himself, something he did every single day now. They stopped for ice cream on the way home, even though it was a Wednesday. Her favorite mint chocolate chip in a waffle cone. "Daddy, you seem really different lately," Emma observed thoughtfully while they sat on a bench. "Happier than you used to be." "Yeah, Bug. I think I actually am happier. Because of your new important job. Because I'm doing work that genuinely matters now. Work that actually helps people stay safe. Work your mom would have been proud of if she could see it." Emma nodded with the seriousness only a 7-year-old could manage. She would definitely be proud of you. I'm really proud of you, too. Dylan pulled his daughter close, feeling the weight of the past 3 years finally starting to lift from his shoulders. He'd never stopped missing Lily with an ache that sometimes still took his breath away. Never stopped wishing desperately that she was here to see Emma grow into the amazing person she was becoming. But he'd made absolutely certain her death wasn't just another conveniently covered-up casualty of corporate greed and ambition. He'd turned his deepest pain into genuine purpose. And maybe that was the only kind of justice that actually lasted beyond headlines and legal settlements. Not revenge that destroyed you while destroying your enemies, but transformation that built something better. Taking the worst thing that ever happened to you and using it to make sure it didn't happen to someone else. The underdog hadn't just risen against impossible odds. He'd fundamentally changed the rules of the entire game. And as Dylan walked home through the cooling evening with Emma's hand secure in his, he realized that was the real victory that mattered. Not destroying Vanessa Drake's empire or bringing down corrupt executives, but building something genuinely better and more ethical in the ruins. Creating a world where people like Lily didn't have to die simply for getting too close to uncomfortable truths. That was the lesson he'd carry forward, the thing he'd teach Emma as she continued growing up. Real strength wasn't about being invincible or untouchable or never showing vulnerability. It was about being human enough and brave enough to care deeply, even when caring hurt, and courageous enough to act on that caring, even when you were absolutely terrified of the consequences. Power was ultimately just a tool, morally neutral in itself. What actually mattered was what you chose to build with it, what you protected with it, whose lives you improved with it. And Dylan Cross, the invisible assistant who'd become the man who brought down a corrupt empire and rebuilt something better from its ashes, was only just getting started with that work. The fight for accountability and safety would never really be finished. But now he was fighting it from a position where he could actually make a difference that lasted beyond his own personal story. That was enough. More than enough. It was everything that mattered.